Section 1. The World of Springfield, a town like no other. Find somewhere comfortable. Pull the blanket up a little higher. There is nothing you need to do right now, nowhere you need to be, and no decision waiting on you tonight that cannot wait until morning. We are going to spend the next 4 hours in Springfield together, drifting slowly through 36 years of stories, characters, secrets, and history that most people have never had the patience to sit with all at once. This is not a deep dive full of alarming revelations. This is a long, slow walk through a town we have all spent pieces of our lives in, told at the pace of a bedtime story. By the time we reach the end, you will know Springfield in a way that most fans never do, not because the information is hidden, but because nobody ever took the time to lay it all out, piece by piece, in a voice quiet enough to follow into sleep. So, let's begin at the beginning. Not with a theory, not with a mystery, just with a town. Springfield sits somewhere in the interior of the American imagination. It has a nuclear power plant with 2 cooling towers that you can see from almost anywhere in town, a plant that has been quietly humming and occasionally leaking since before most of its residents can clearly remember. It has a downtown with a Quickie Mart on a corner that seems to exist in every neighborhood simultaneously, a tavern called Moe's that smells like spilled ambition, and a city hall that has been burned down, flooded, and sieged by mobs more times than any municipal building ought to be. It has a gorge, Springfield Gorge, which sits at the edge of town like a punchline waiting to happen. It has a tire fire that has been burning since sometime in the 1970s and is now considered a local landmark. Springfield is the most thoroughly mapped fictional town in the history of American television, and somehow it is also the most geographically impossible. It borders at least 4 different states depending on the episode. It has oceanfront property and mountain ranges, and flatland farmland and desert all within driving distance of each other. It is in the north, and the south, and the heartland, and the coast, depending on which story needs to be told. Its area code has been listed as belonging to Missouri. Its state abbreviation has appeared as letters that do not correspond to any real American state. Its weather ranges from blizzard to tropical within a single season. And yet it feels completely, utterly real. That paradox is the first thing you need to understand about Springfield, because it is the key to why 36 years of stories set there have landed so consistently, why the town never wore out its welcome the way so many fictional settings do. Springfield is not trying to be any particular place, it is trying to be every place. Every industrial Midwestern town that grew up around a single employer. Every small New England community where everyone knows everyone and nobody talks about what they know. Every Sunbelt suburb that sprawled out across cheap land in the 1980s and filled up with strip malls and cul-de-sacs and people who moved there from somewhere else and never quite figured out how to be from here. The show's creator, Matt Groening, named Springfield after Springfield, Oregon, which is where he grew up watching television and imagining other worlds. But he was also deliberate about making the name as American as possible. Springfield is one of the most common city names in the entire country. Nearly every state has one. There are Springfields in Illinois, in Missouri, in Massachusetts, in Ohio, in Tennessee, in Virginia, and on through the Atlas until the name loses all geographic specificity and becomes simply a word for a place where things happen. That was the point. You could not plant a flag on Springfield's location because Springfield was supposed to feel like yours, wherever you were sitting. The town was designed from the very beginning as a portrait of the American middle class at a specific moment in history, the late 1980s, a period when the working-class economic anxiety of the 70s had been papered over with a thin layer of Reagan-era optimism, and underneath that paper, the cracks were already spreading. The nuclear power plant as Springfield's primary employer was not accidental. The nuclear industry was a particular kind of American symbol in that era, enormous and invisible at the same time, promising clean energy and cheap electricity while its waste products accumulated in places nobody wanted to look at. Homer working inside that plant as a safety inspector was a joke that cut in several directions at once: at corporate negligence, at working-class precarity, at the particular American habit of handing important jobs to the least qualified person available and then being surprised when things go wrong. But those ideas were always background architecture. What the audience came for, and what kept them coming back across 36 seasons and nearly 800 episodes, was something simpler: a family. A genuinely specific, genuinely strange, genuinely lovable family who lived in a house at 742 Evergreen Terrace and whose problems, despite being filtered through cartoon absurdism, were always fundamentally human. The Simpson house itself deserves a moment of attention, because it is one of the most recognized pieces of architecture in the world, despite being entirely fictional. The layout has been famously inconsistent across the show's run rooms, appear and disappear, staircases shift positions. The basement exists sometimes and doesn't other times, but the feeling of the house has never changed. It is a home. It has a couch in the living room that the family rushes to at the end of every opening credit sequence, colliding into each other in configurations that change every single week and have become their own 36-year art project. It has a kitchen where Marge cooks things nobody quite wants to eat. It has a garage that Homer has filled with the detritus of 100 abandoned hobbies. It has Bart's room, which has a window perfect for sneaking out of, and Lisa's room, which has a saxophone case and a bookshelf that suggests depths the rest of the house does not. And it sits on a street in a neighborhood that feels, somehow, like the neighborhood. The place you might have grown up in if you grew up somewhere quiet and a little worn at the edges. The Flanders house is next door, impeccably maintained. The road curves gently away toward the rest of Springfield. There are trees. It is in the particular way that fictional places can sometimes manage a home. Springfield grew into its geography across the first few seasons with a kind of improvisational confidence. New locations were introduced as the stories needed them and then became permanent fixtures of the landscape. Moe's Tavern appeared because Homer needed somewhere to drink. Springfield Elementary appeared because Bart and Lisa needed somewhere to fail. The nuclear plant existed from the pilot, but the Springfield Museum, the Springfield Zoo, the retirement castle where Grandpa Simpson lives, the First Church of Springfield where Reverend Lovejoy delivers his weekly pastoral non-event, the Springfield Police Department where Chief Wiggum runs the most benevolently incompetent law enforcement operation in American fiction, all of these emerged gradually, assembled piece by piece into something that began to feel like a real civic ecosystem. The Quick E-Mart deserves its own paragraph. Run by Apu Nahasapi Mapedalun, who holds a PhD in computer science from the Calcutta Institute of Technology and chose to operate a convenience store in Springfield for reasons the show never entirely explains, the Quick E-Mart is the town's true community center. More significant conversations happen in that store than in any government building Springfield possesses. It is open at all hours. It sells products of questionable provenance. Its hot dogs have been rotating on the grill for a period of time that health codes were not designed to accommodate. And it is where Springfield comes together in the small, unremarkable, genuinely important ways that communities actually come together not at town meetings or civic ceremonies, but at 2 a.m. when someone needs a squishy and another person needs someone to talk to. The population of Springfield has been cited at various points as approximately 30,000 people, though the town's capacity to produce enormous crowds at a moment's notice suggests the real number may be higher. The recurring characters alone form a social ecosystem of remarkable density. You have the Springfield Elementary World Principal Skinner, whose real identity we will get to eventually, Superintendent Chalmers, who arrives periodically like a weather system and departs having changed nothing, Mrs. Krabappel, Bart's long-suffering fourth-grade teacher whose entire arc is one of the show's quietly devastating ongoing storylines, and the children Milhouse, Nelson, Martin, Sherry and Terry, each of whom is a fully realized type of childhood misery. You have the civic infrastructure Mayor Quimby, who is a Kennedy impression who became a character, Dr. Hibbert, whose laugh arrives slightly ahead of any bad news he is about to deliver, Dr. Nick Riviera, whose medical incompetence has become a kind of comfort, the Lovejoys, the Wiggums, Judge Snyder. You have Patty and Selma Bouvier, Marge's sisters, who are a Greek chorus of marital pessimism. You have Sideshow Bob and his operatic villainy. You have Snake, the town's recurring criminal, and Fat Tony, its recurring mob presence. And you have the people who exist simply to make Springfield feel populated, the ones who appear in backgrounds and crowd scenes and occasional speaking roles, the Sea Captain, Disco Stu, the Professor, Groundskeeper Willie, Lunchlady Doris, and Hans Moleman, who has been dying and returning with such regularity that his continued existence is perhaps the deepest philosophical mystery the show has ever posed. What all of these characters share, underneath their individual comic functions, is a kind of earnestness that the show never entirely abandoned, even as the writing shifted across the decades. Springfield is full of people who are trying. They are trying imperfectly, sometimes absurdly, occasionally dangerously, but they are trying. Ned Flanders is trying to be good. Marge is trying to hold a family together. Lisa is trying to change a world that does not want to be changed. Even Burns, in his most human moments, is trying to hold on to a life that the universe has been attempting to reclaim for over a century. That earnestness is what kept the show from becoming cynical even when its satire was at its sharpest. The Simpsons was always, at its core, a show about people doing their best with what they had. The comedy came from the gap between what they aspired to and what they achieved. But the aspiration was always real. Now, the thing that makes Springfield genuinely worth spending hours exploring is not any single character or any single storyline. It is the accumulation. 36 years of a fictional town means that Springfield has a history more layered and internally complex than most real cities of comparable size. Events from Season 2 are referenced in Season 20. Character details established in throwaway lines in the early 90s turn out to have been load-bearing walls that later stories depend on. The show has its contradictions, many of them, and significant ones, but it also has a coherent mythology, a deep bench of history, and a genuine sense of place that rewards the kind of slow, attentive engagement we are going to give it tonight. So, here is what we are going to do. We are going to drift through this town at the pace of a very slow walk on a very quiet night. We will visit its residents one by one, starting with the family at the center of it all. We will follow the storylines that defined each character, the episodes that revealed something essential about who they were, the moments of genuine emotional weight that accumulated over the years beneath the surface of the comedy. We will take our time. There is nothing to rush toward. The night is long and Springfield is deep, and by the time we have explored all of it, sleep should find you easily. But before we move into the family itself, one more moment with the town, because Springfield has a particular quality that is worth naming before we lose ourselves in the specifics of individual characters. It is the quality of permanence. In the real world, things change. Neighborhoods gentrify or decay. The corner store becomes a condo. The factory closes. The kids grow up and move away and come back with different accents and spouses their parents have to learn to like. The town you grew up in is never quite the town you remember, and part of being alive is learning to hold both versions at once, the remembered place and the present one, without getting lost in the distance between them. Springfield does not do that. Springfield stays. The Quickie Mart is always there, Moe's is always there, the couch is always there. Every Sunday night, or whenever you sit down with the show, the same family rushes to that couch, the same music plays, and the same town arranges itself around them as it always has. That permanence is, depending on your philosophical orientation, either a comfort or a kind of uncanny strangeness. But it is real. Springfield persists, and there is something genuinely soothing about a place that will always be what it was. All right, let's meet the family. Now, before we move on, if you are watching this late at night, or early in the morning, or somewhere in between, drop a comment telling us where you are and what time it is. There is something quietly wonderful about knowing that someone in one corner of the world and someone in another are both settling in for the same 4 hours of Springfield. And if you are enjoying this so far, please do subscribe. It helps more than you might think, and there is a lot more of this to come. Section 2. Homer Simpson the Man, the Mystery, the Mythology. Homer J. Simpson is 39 years old. He has been 39 years old for 36 years. He lives at 742 Evergreen Terrace in Springfield with his wife Marge and their 3 children. He works as a safety inspector at the Springfield Nuclear Power Plant in Sector 7G, a role he has held despite demonstrating, on essentially every working day of his tenure, that he is constitutionally unsuited for any job that requires sustained attention, basic scientific literacy, or the ability to distinguish between a donut and an emergency warning. He weighs somewhere between 200 and 260 pounds, depending on the episode. He has a ring of dark hair around an otherwise bald head that the show presents as the result of stress, specifically the stress of raising Bart, but that the continuity suggests has been his hair configuration since at least his teenage years. He has 4 fingers on each hand, which he shares with every other human resident of Springfield, and which nobody in Springfield has ever found worth remarking upon. His eyes are large and perpetually slightly unfocused. His mouth, in repose, hangs open in a way that suggests his brain has not quite sent the signal to close it yet. He is, by any objective measure, an unlikely hero. And yet Homer Simpson is the most beloved character in the history of American animation, and possibly in the broader history of American television comedy. The question of why, the real answer to why a man this spectacularly imperfect became so deeply beloved, is one of the most interesting questions the show has ever posed. The surface answer is that Homer is funny. He is extraordinarily funny. The physical comedy he enables, falling downstairs, getting his fingers caught in things, walking into walls, tumbling into the gorge, sliding off rooftops, being launched from catapults, surviving car impacts, explosions, and animal attacks is some of the most precisely choreographed slapstick in television history. The writers understood that Homer's body was a comedic instrument of remarkable range, and across the show's run they played it with genuine virtuosity. But Homer's comedy was never only physical. Some of the show's best jokes live in Homer's interiority, in the gap between the grandiosity of his self-conception and the smallness of his actual capacity. Homer believes himself to be a reasonable man, a good father, an adequate employee, and an acceptable member of society. The comedy comes from how completely wrong he is about all of this, and how sincerely he holds the belief despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. There is something in that particular kind of self-delusion that resonates on a very deep level, because most people carry some version of it. The gap between who we think we are and who we are is the most universal human comedy. But here's the thing about Homer that the show gradually revealed across its run. The thing that elevated him from a simple comedic foil to something genuinely moving. Homer's failures are not his fault. Not entirely. Not even mostly. Let's go back to the beginning of his story, because Homer's life began in circumstances that most people never fully register when they watch the show casually. He was born to Abe and Mona Simpson in Springfield. His father, Abraham Simpson, was a World War II veteran with a gift for storytelling that bore essentially no relationship to the events he was describing, and an emotional range that had been significantly narrowed by the experience of the war and the subsequent experience of being a human being in mid-20th century America, which did not reward emotional openness in men. Abe was not warm. He was not cruel either, but warmth was not in his repertoire. His mother, Mona, was another matter entirely. Mona was present for the first years of Homer's life, and by all accounts she was attentive, loving, and genuinely engaged with her son in a way that Abe was not. Homer adored her. The show makes this clear in every episode, where his childhood is glimpsed the warmth in young Homer's face when Mona appears, the particular quality of ease he had in her presence that he never quite found anywhere else. And then she disappeared. When Homer was approximately 6 years old, Mona was forced to leave. The full story came out decades later in the Season 7 episode that many fans consider one of the greatest the show has ever produced. She had gotten involved in activist causes during the late 1960s, had taken part in a raid on a biological weapons laboratory owned by Mr. Burns, and during that raid Burns had seen her face. He reported her to the federal authorities. She became a fugitive and was unable to return home without risking arrest. She kissed her sleeping son goodbye and walked out into the night, and Homer woke up the next morning and she was simply gone. Abe told Homer she was dead. He showed him a grave. He maintained this fiction for Homer's entire childhood, adolescence, and the first several decades of Homer's adult life. The grave he pointed to, it eventually turned out, belonged to Walt Whitman, the poet, which suggests either that Abe had not looked closely at the headstone or that he found the irony appropriate. Think about what this does to a child. Homer spent 30-plus years believing his mother had died when he was small, which means he spent 30-plus years carrying the particular weight of maternal loss. The grief that cannot be grieved properly, because you never understood what you lost. It shaped his relationship with love in the most fundamental possible way. He craved it constantly, visibly, almost embarrassingly. He needed reassurance from Marge in quantities that a more emotionally secure person would not have required. He was pathologically afraid of abandonment. He worked at a job that treated him badly for a boss who could not remember his name, and he stayed because the alternative, losing even this thin thread of stability, was more frightening than whatever the job could do to him. Then there is the matter of the crayon. In the Season 12 episode where Homer's intelligence becomes the focus, it is revealed that a crayon has been lodged in Homer's brain since childhood. The crayon, inserted apparently during a very specific kind of childhood recklessness with art supplies, had been pressing against the section of Homer's brain responsible for higher cognitive function for his entire life. When the crayon was removed, Homer's IQ climbed to approximately 105, perfectly average, but dramatically higher than his functional baseline. He became articulate, observant, and suddenly capable of engaging with the world's complexity in ways he had never been able to before. He also became miserable. The intelligence brought him no peace because Springfield was not built for intelligent people, at least not for people who chose to live openly within their intelligence. He saw his job clearly. He saw his social circle clearly. He saw the gap between what his life was and what he might have wanted it to be, and the gap was unbearable. He chose to have the crayon reinserted. He chose, consciously and deliberately, to return to the fog. This is one of the most quietly devastating moments in the show's entire run, and it passes without fanfare. Homer makes his choice, the episode ends, and the next week everything is back to normal. But if you sit with it, the implications are enormous. Homer is not stupid because of some innate deficiency. He is cognitively impaired due to physical brain damage sustained in childhood, and the damage has been compounded throughout his adult life by working in close proximity to an active nuclear reactor with 342 safety violations. His baseline intelligence, the ceiling of what he could reach, was sufficient for a full and reasonably competent life, and he chose to abandon it because full awareness of his circumstances was simply too painful to live with. That is not stupidity. That is tragedy wearing a clown costume. Homer's relationship with Marge is the emotional spine of the entire show, and it deserves a careful, extended look because it is one of the most genuinely complex romantic relationships in the history of television comedy. They met in high school, the story of their courtship has been told and retold, the timeline sliding forward with each retelling as the show's floating chronology demanded, but the essentials remaining constant. He saw her across a room and immediately completely wanted to know her. He pursued her with a combination of persistence and genuine sweetness that was distinctly Homerian, not smooth, not cool, entirely sincere. She was initially uninterested and then gradually, despite herself, charmed. Their early relationship had genuine electricity. Young Homer and Marge, in the flashback episodes that showed their courtship, had a chemistry that was recognizable and real. He made her laugh. She made him feel worthy. The pairing of the girl who played saxophone with the boy who was already becoming the man he was going to be had the particular quality of teenage love that carries a freight of meaning and memory, the sense that even at the time you knew this was important. They married young. Under circumstances that the show depicted with characteristic sensitivity, Marge was pregnant with Bart. They were barely adults. They did it in a roadside chapel in a moment that was hurried and unglamorous and completely right for them. And then the marriage settled into the particular shape of a long marriage, which is to say it became a daily practice rather than an event. It required maintenance. It required patience. It required each of them to decide, repeatedly, that the other person was worth the choosing. Homer was not always easy to choose. The show was honest about this in ways that many comedies about marriage are not. Homer forgot anniversaries. He made promises he did not keep. He spent money before checking with Marge. He embarked on schemes that absorbed household resources and ended in disaster. He occasionally took Marge's presence in his life completely for granted, the way people take water and air for granted, not through malice but through the comfortable blindness of people who have been together long enough to believe the other person is simply a feature of the landscape. The episodes where the marriage came under genuine pressure, where Marge's patience reached its limit, where she came close to leaving, where her unhappiness became the story's center of gravity rather than its background hum, are among the show's most emotionally serious achievements. The Season 4 episode where Marge develops a gambling addiction, the Season 6 episode where she briefly considers whether she might want something different from her life, the various moments throughout the run where she articulated, with the particular quietness of someone who has been holding something for a long time, that she had given up pieces of herself for this marriage and this family, and was not always sure the trade was worth it. What kept her there was not obligation, though obligation was certainly present. What kept her there was Homer himself, in his better moments. Because Homer at his best, Homer when he was paying attention, Homer, when the fog lifted for a moment and he actually saw the woman he had married, was capable of a love so direct and uncomplicated that it was almost embarrassing to witness. He did not perform it. He did not dress it up. He simply loved her, entirely, as a fact. And Marge, who had been loved in a complicated, conditional way by the world outside her marriage, needed that simplicity the way Springfield's water needed filtration. Homer's relationship with Bart has its own particular texture, the texture of two people who are essentially the same person at different life stages, and therefore cannot stop annoying each other. Bart is Homer's son, in all the ways that are simultaneously easiest and hardest to love: the impulsiveness, the recklessness, the complete inability to think past the immediate moment, the charm that rescues him from consequences that should be terminal. Homer strangles Bart. This is presented as a joke, a running gag, and functionally it is one, but it is also a portrait of the particular frustrated love of a parent who sees himself in his child and cannot decide whether that is wonderful or horrible. Underneath the strangling, underneath the exasperation and the incomprehension, and the moments where Homer simply cannot fathom how he ended up with this specific small human as his son, there is a love that the show occasionally made explicit in ways that landed with tremendous force. The Season 8 episode where Homer became Bart's soccer coach, the arc where Homer's own inadequacy became the thing that unexpectedly connected them, the quiet moments at the end of episodes where the joke had resolved and what remained was just a father and a son on the same side of the same couch, existing together. His relationship with Lisa is in some ways more interesting because it is a relationship across a wider gap. Lisa is, in terms of intellectual orientation, essentially the opposite of her father. She thinks clearly, speaks precisely, cares about truth, values, complexity, and nuance in a world that does not reward these qualities. Homer, at his functional baseline, cannot follow most of what Lisa says. The gap between them should make genuine connection impossible. And yet, the Season 5 episode where Homer gets a gun and Lisa objects, and the argument between them becomes a genuine disagreement between two fully realized people who love each other and cannot agree. The Season 8 episode where Homer carries Lisa down a mountain on his back after she sprains her ankle on a camping trip they both attended under duress, and tells her, in the specific way Homer tells people things that matter, that he loves her, and that whatever she turns out to be is fine with him. The recurring motif of Homer attending Lisa's school performance is not because he understands what he is watching, but because she is there, and that is sufficient reason. Homer's relationship with Maggie is the quietest of the three parental relationships, which is appropriate given Maggie's policy of silence. He loves her with a particular gentleness that suggests he understands, on some level beneath articulation, that Maggie is the most remarkable of his children. There is a recurring image throughout the show's run of Homer holding Maggie with a care and tenderness that he does not always manage to deploy consistently in other areas of his parenting, as if she is something fragile that he is aware he is not always equipped to handle. As if with her, the love is more feeling than behavior. The famous moment from the earlier seasons, when Homer kept a note pinned inside his work locker that read, "Do it for her," over a photograph of baby Maggie, tells you everything about what keeps Homer returning to the plant every day. Not ambition, not financial necessity, though necessity is real, but love, a specific, practical, daily love that says this is hard, and I am not built for it, and I am going to do it anyway because the alternative is unthinkable. Homer has also, across the show's run, accumulated a biography so sprawling and contradictory that it constitutes its own separate genre of Simpsons analysis. He has held hundreds of distinct jobs, from astronaut to grease merchant, to food critic, to professional bodyguard, to member of a barbershop quartet, to small-time criminal, to owner of a sandwich franchise, to employee of the month at a brewery, to assistant to a Hollywood talent agent. He has traveled to dozens of countries, met multiple sitting presidents, appeared on television programs in a variety of capacities, achieved local celebrity for a series of reasons that make no consistent sense, and somehow always returned to Sector 7G and the same blue jumpsuit and the same chair in front of the same panel of controls. The show explained this inconsistency through the floating timeline. Homer's life is perpetually reset to its default configuration, regardless of what extraordinary things have intervened, but what the floating timeline cannot fully account for is what these experiences do to Homer as a person. If we take the biography seriously, Homer Simpson has lived more lives than almost any fictional character in history. He has seen more of the world, failed in more ambitious ways, recovered from more catastrophic reversals, and started over more times than a person ought to be able to. There is something about this accumulation, taken all together, that transforms Homer from a buffoon into something stranger and more interesting. a man of infinite reinvention who keeps coming home to the same house, the same wife, the same kids, the same couch. Not because he has to, because that is where he wants to be. And that, finally, is the answer to the question we started with. Why is Homer Simpson so beloved, despite everything? Because he wants to go home. He always wants to go home. No matter where the story takes him, no matter how far from Evergreen Terrace any given episode carries him, Homer wants to return to the family he did not entirely deserve, and the house he sometimes forgot to appreciate, and the life that, seen from the outside, might look like failure but seen from the inside was the whole point. He was broken by his childhood, impaired by his environment, failed by institutions that were supposed to protect him, and none of it extinguished the particular stubborn warmth at the center of him. He kept loving people. He kept trying. He kept getting up off the floor and going back to work and sitting down at the dinner table and being, imperfectly and entirely, Homer. There is a reason people have been watching him for 36 years. He is not aspirational. He is not admirable in any conventional sense. But he is deeply, recognizably human in all the ways that are most embarrassing and most honest. And in a medium that usually prefers its heroes polished, Homer's spectacular roughness felt like truth. Section 3. Marge Simpson, the quiet architect of everything. Marjorie Jacqueline Simpson, née Bouvier, is one of the most underappreciated characters in the history of television. This is not a controversial claim among people who have thought carefully about the show. It is simply a fact that tends to disappear beneath the enormous gravity of Homer's presence and the sharper, more immediately recognizable qualities of Bart and Lisa. Marge exists in the middle of the family's narrative like a structural beam essential, largely invisible, the reason the whole thing does not collapse. She was born the youngest of 3 daughters to Clancy and Jacqueline Bouvier, though her relationship to birth order was complicated by her 2 older sisters, Patty and Selma, whose presence in Marge's life reads as a kind of sustained ambient pressure. Patty and Selma are not bad people, but they are people for whom pessimism has calcified into personality, and they have never quite been able to celebrate Marge's marriage to Homer without also, simultaneously, cataloging everything wrong with it. This has been going on for 36 years. Marge has absorbed it with a patience that borders on the supernatural. The Bouvier household was genteel in its self-perception, if not always in its reality. Clancy Bouvier was a flight attendant, a job that, in the era of Marge's childhood, carried a particular kind of aspirational glamour, and the family's self-image was constructed partly around this professional proximity to travel and sophistication. Jacqueline Bouvier was formidable in the specific way of women of her generation, who channeled their considerable intelligence and ambition into the management of a household and a family, and called it enough, though it was not always enough. Marge inherited a great deal from her mother, including a talent for quietly enduring more than she let on. Marge's most immediately distinguishing feature is her hair. It rises approximately 2 feet above her head in a tower of blue, a shade that the show has at various points attributed to dye, to natural pigmentation, and to the particular genetic inheritance of the Bouvier women. She has maintained this hairstyle in essentially the same configuration for the entirety of the show's run, which is to say for 36 years, which is to say that her hair has outlasted most political movements, several technological revolutions, and the entire career spans of musicians who were famous when she first appeared on television. Her hair is one of the great monuments of American fictional design. She was, in the early seasons of the show, defined primarily by her relationship to the family. She was Homer's wife, she was Bart's harried mother, she was Lisa's patient sounding board. The show used her almost architecturally. She was the stable center around which the chaotic energy of the other 4 Simpsons revolved. When things went wrong, Marge was the one who made them right, or at least made them manageable. When Homer made some colossal error of judgment, Marge was the one who decided whether the marriage survived it. When Bart crossed a line, Marge was the one who took the call from Principal Skinner and decided what the consequences would be. When Lisa needed someone to listen without judgment, Marge was there, listening. This is not a small thing, though it is often treated as one. The emotional labor that Marge performs across 3 decades of family life, the relentless maintenance work of keeping 4 highly individualized and frequently combustive personalities oriented toward each other with enough goodwill to function as a unit, is staggering. The show understood this even in its early seasons, and there is a quiet dignity in how Marge carries it, though there is also a quiet cost. The most important thing to understand about Marge is that she had a full interior life long before the show started mining it seriously. The first real signal of this came in the season 1 episode where Marge becomes a painting student and discovers that she has genuine talent. She produces a portrait of Burns that is startling in its psychological accuracy. She has painted him as the predatory, rapacious figure he actually is, and the painting is both technically accomplished and emotionally honest in a way that nothing else in the room is. When Burns sees it, he purchases it immediately and displays it prominently, apparently unable to distinguish between an honest portrait and a flattering one. Marge is praised. The painting is a success. And then the episode ends and Marge puts down the brush and goes back to being the person who makes dinner. This pattern, Marge discovers a talent or a passion. The family's needs reassert themselves. The talent or passion is set aside recurs throughout the show's run, with a consistency that is either commentary or oversight, and the best reading is that it is both. The show was conscious that it was depicting a woman whose individual gifts were regularly subordinated to her family role. It was also, by the structures of its storytelling, regularly subordinating those gifts. The discomfort between the critique and the practice is one of the places where the show's relationship to Marge became genuinely interesting. Her foray into law enforcement in the season 6 episode where she joins the Springfield Police Department is another example of this dynamic in action. Marge proves to be an exceptionally capable police officer, disciplined, attentive, good with people, exactly the qualities that the Springfield Police Department is historically most deficient in. She is good at the job in a way that Homer is almost never good at his. And the story ultimately returns her to her domestic role, though not without some acknowledgement of what she is giving up. Her brief career as a real estate agent, her stint as a bodybuilder, her time running an erotic bakery, her position as a player in a local theatrical production, each of these episodes gives Marge a temporary occupation of her own interests, a space outside the family's gravitational pull, and each of them ultimately resolves with Marge returning to the family in a way that carries the weight of choice, even when it does not always feel entirely chosen. The season 4 episode, A Streetcar Named Marge, is perhaps the show's single most sophisticated exploration of Marge's interior life. She auditions for and is cast in a local production of a musical version of Tennessee Williams' A Streetcar Named Desire. The role she is given is Blanche Dubois, the deluded romantic who mistakes the cruelty of her circumstances for something she can manage by force of refinement. Marge finds her way into the role through the frustration she feels at home. The director tells her to access her anger, and at first, Marge insists she has no anger, because Marge does not allow herself to have anger, and then gradually she finds it. She finds it because it is real, and the performance she delivers is genuinely moving, not because Marge has become Blanche, but because Blanche's particular tragedy of a woman who accommodated herself to less than she deserved, because she could not see a way to demand more resonated with something Marge recognized. Homer attends the performance planning to fake enthusiasm for something he could not care less about, and then sits in the audience genuinely transported, genuinely seeing Marge as someone beyond his immediate experience of her, someone with depths and dimensions he had been failing to attend to. The episode ends on a note of renewed connection between them. But what lingers, what the episode is actually about, is Marge's anger, the thing she had to be told she was allowed to feel. The thing she had been managing on everyone's behalf while suppressing entirely within herself. Marge worries. This is her most persistent mode, and it is both a narrative function and a characterization choice with real depth. She worries about Homer's health, his job, his drinking. She worries about Bart's trajectory. The show depicts her relationship with Bart's future with a particular parental terror, the terror of a mother who loves her child without illusion and therefore sees clearly the ways in which the world is not going to make things easy for him. She worries about Lisa's isolation, the way Lisa's brilliance separates her from everyone around her, the particular loneliness of the most perceptive person in a room that does not want to be perceived. She worries about Maggie in the background register that all parents of babies maintain, the low hum of vigilance that never entirely quiets. She also, less discussed, worries about herself. This surfaced most directly in the episode where she develops a gambling addiction, a storyline that surprised many viewers because it seemed so un-Marge and turned out to be deeply Marge on examination. The gambling gave Marge something she rarely allowed herself: uncomplicated excitement. The casinos were loud and bright and nobody needed anything from her inside them. She could sit at a slot machine and exist inside a simple cause and effect relationship that did not require her to anticipate three other people's emotional needs. The addiction that followed was the show's way of showing that Marge's patient management of family life had an underside, a place where the suppressed desire for something purely her own had been accumulating pressure. Her sobriety in that episode, her decision to attend Gamblers Anonymous and recommit to the family is handled with the same quiet dignity that Marge brings to most of her significant choices. She does not make it into a dramatic moment. She simply decides, and then she follows through, because Marge follows through. It is, in fact, one of the things she does best. The friendship between Marge and her neighbor, Helen Lovejoy, deserves a brief note. Helen Lovejoy, won't someone please think of the children, is Springfield's most vocal moral authority, and she and Marge occupy adjacent social positions in the community that occasionally create friction. Marge is genuinely virtuous in a way that Helen performs. Marge helps her neighbors because she wants to. Helen organizes causes because it gives her standing. They appear together frequently at church, at community events, in the background of civic crises, and the contrast between Marge's authentic decency and Helen's performative moralism is one of the show's most consistent, subtle jokes. Marge's relationship with her sisters is the most complex relationship she has with anyone outside her immediate family. Patty and Selma Bouvier are her older sisters, and they have disliked Homer from the beginning with a thoroughness that has never abated across 3.5 decades. From their perspective, this dislike is entirely justified. Homer has been, by any external metric, a deeply imperfect partner for their sister, and they were there from the beginning to observe his imperfections at close range. From Marge's perspective, the dislike is an intrusion, a constant low-level challenge to the choice she has made and continues to make about her life. What the show does interestingly with this dynamic is refuse to let Patty and Selma be simply wrong. They are not wrong about Homer. He is genuinely difficult. Their assessment of him is largely accurate. But they are also unable to see what Marge sees in him, which is the thing that the external assessment misses. And Marge's loyalty to her marriage, in the face of her sister's sustained skepticism, is one of the quietest statements the show makes about the nature of intimacy, that other people cannot fully understand what two specific people are to each other, that the view from inside a marriage is categorically different from the view from outside it, and that love is not something that external observers can audit. One of the most moving, recurring elements of Marge's storyline is her voice. Not her speaking voice, though, that has its own distinctive quality, warm and a little careful, as if she is always moderating what she says before she says it, but her singing voice. Marge sang in several episodes across the show's run, and each time it was deployed, the show was doing something deliberate. Her voice was beautiful, and hearing it was always a reminder that there was more to her than the daily domestic routine. That inside the woman making lunches and taking phone calls from Skinner and negotiating between Homer and the kids was someone whose emotional range extended well beyond what any given Tuesday at 742 Evergreen Terrace typically asked of her. She is also, quietly, one of the funniest characters in the show. Not in the broad, immediate way that Homer is funny or the deadpan wit that Lisa deploys, but in the specific way of someone who sees clearly and chooses, most of the time, to respond with kindness anyway. When Marge delivers a line dry, when the show gives her a moment of weariness so honest that it becomes comedy, it lands with tremendous precision, because the groundwork of all those patient, sincere moments creates the perfect setup. Marge Simpson is the reason there is a show. Not technically there is a show because Matt Groening pitched it and Fox bought it, but emotionally. She is the reason the family holds together, which is the reason the show has somewhere to return every week, which is the reason Springfield remains habitable despite everything. She is not the funniest character. She is not the most narratively compelling most of the time. She is, quietly and consistently, the most essential. The structural element without which everything falls. The patience without which nothing gets resolved. The love without which none of the rest of it means anything. The show knew this, even when it did not say it directly. The episode that made it most explicit was the late-season installment where Homer imagines his life without Marge, following a near miss with the possibility that they might never have met. The world the show constructed Homer adrift, the children absent or different, the house on Evergreen Terrace occupied by strangers was not played for broad comedy. It was played as a genuine reckoning with what the presence of one specific person means to the texture of a life. Homer's life without Marge was not merely worse. It was not legible as a life at all. Not in any way that Homer could inhabit with the scraps of purpose he needed. She knows this too. In her quieter moments, in the spaces between the worry and the management and the patience, Marge knows that she is the load-bearing element, and she carries it with a combination of genuine love for the family and genuine awareness of the cost. She is not a saint. She is not a martyr, at least not by self-description. She is a woman who made a choice and keeps making it, every day, and who contains within herself a full and complicated interior world that the family around her rarely has the attention to see. But the audience can see it, and 36 years in, that visibility, the sense that the show understands and honors who Marge is, even when the structure of its storytelling asks her to subordinate herself again and again, is part of what has kept viewers returning to Springfield. They want to see her. They want to know she is okay. They want to sit with her for a while, in the kitchen of 742 Evergreen Terrace, and be in the presence of someone who is trying her best in a world that does not always make it easy, and doing so without complaint, and doing so for love. That is Marge, the quiet architect, the load-bearing beam, the most underrated character in the most analyzed show in television history. And if, somewhere in the reading of all of this, you find yourself getting sleepy, that is fine. That is the point. Springfield is not going anywhere. It will be here when you come back. Section 4. Bart Simpson, the rebel with 1,000 storylines. Bartholomew Jojo Simpson is 10 years old. He wears a red shirt and blue shorts and white sneakers that have been the same shade of dirty for 36 years. His hair is a remarkable construction, 6 spikes radiating from a central point on the crown of his head, each one precise, each one immovable, defying both gravity and the passage of time with equal conviction. He has a slingshot he does not always use, and a skateboard he rides with a particular kind of reckless confidence that suggests he has never once thought about the consequences of falling. He is the most famous child in American popular culture, which is a sentence that would have meant something very specific in the early 1990s and now means something different. But the underlying truth remains. In his first season on television, Bart Simpson was a cultural phenomenon. His face was on t-shirts, his catchphrases were on bumper stickers, his attitude was being cited in newspaper editorials as evidence of cultural decline. Schools across the country reportedly banned shirts featuring his image. Parents were alarmed, children were devoted. The Bart Simpson of that initial cultural moment, the deliberately transgressive, authority-challenging, endlessly quotable kid from Springfield, was a simplified version of the character the show would eventually build. The early Bart was mostly id, impulse, and mischief, and the pure animal pleasure of chaos. He was Bart doing things, which was funny and instantly legible and not particularly deep. The deeper Bart, the one who emerged as the writers got comfortable and the show found its more complex register, was something considerably more interesting. The essential thing about Bart Simpson, the thing that every successful episode about him eventually touches, is that he is profoundly, specifically lonely. This sounds strange when applied to a character who is surrounded by friends Milhouse, Nelson, Martin, various other Springfield elementary students, who is rarely alone in any physical sense, who seems to generate social energy the way other people generate body heat. But Bart's loneliness is not about the absence of company, it is about the absence of recognition. He is not seen, quite, the way he needs to be seen. His father loves him. Homer's love for Bart is genuine and deep, even when it expresses itself as strangulation but does not understand him. Not really. His mother loves him. Marge's love for Bart is perhaps her most strenuous, ongoing effort, the love that requires the most constant renewal, but tends to see him through the lens of potential, which is to say she sees the Bart she hopes he will become rather than the Bart currently standing in front of her. Lisa is his sister and his friend and his antagonist and sometimes the person who knows him best in the world, but their knowing of each other is intermittent, bounded by competition and the ordinary friction of siblings living at close quarters. What Bart wants, underneath the pranks and the chaos and the deliberate cultivation of a reputation for not caring, is to be taken seriously. Not in the Lisa sense, he does not want scholarly recognition or academic achievement. He wants the thing that adult recognition of a child involves, which is the sense that someone sees you as a person with interior complexity rather than a behavioral pattern to be managed. The episodes where Bart achieves this, where an adult character relates to him as a full person rather than a problem, are consistently the show's most emotionally resonant. The substitute teacher episodes are the clearest example of this. In the Season 2 episode Bart Gets an F, Bart faces the possibility of being held back a grade, not an abstract threat, but an imminent one, with a test date set and failure a near certainty. What the episode does that is remarkable is take Bart's academic failure completely seriously. It does not play him as a bad student because he is bad. It plays him as a bad student because he has never believed that the material the school is teaching him matters, and it has never been taught to him as though it matters. And the episode traces the specific, painful way in which Bart tries to close that gap and barely manages. He passes by a single point. He cries. The tears are real, and the show respects them. The Season 2 episode Bart the Genius works with a similar emotional logic, though from the opposite direction. Bart cheats on an IQ test and is placed in a school for gifted children, where he encounters for the first time people who take ideas seriously, and the encounter is disorienting in ways he cannot articulate. He does not belong there either. He is a boy without a tribe, which is the most recognizable form of 10-year-old misery there is. His relationship with authority is the engine of most of his stories, and it is worth examining carefully, because Bart's antagonism to authority is not simple rebellion for its own sake. It is almost always a response to authority that has failed him. The authority he challenges most consistently is the authority of the school principal Skinner. The teachers, the curriculum, and his challenges are not random. They are targeted at the ways in which the institution of Springfield Elementary treats students as raw material rather than as people. He knows when he is being managed. He knows when he is being condescended to. His response is disproportionate, often counterproductive, frequently hilarious, but the underlying grievance is usually legitimate. His relationship with Principal Skinner is one of the great recurring relationships in the show's history, and it is more nuanced than the adversarial dynamic suggests. Skinner, whose real name and identity we will arrive at in the Springfield mythology section, is not entirely wrong about Bart. Bart is disruptive. Bart does cause real harm to the school's operations. Skinner's exasperation is earned. But Skinner is also someone who encounters in Bart a kind of energy and irreverence that he cannot help responding to, despite himself a reminder of something in himself that the years of institutional compliance have suppressed. There are episodes where the antagonism between them softens into something almost collaborative, moments where they are clearly the most interesting thing in each other's daily experience, and these moments give both characters unexpected depth. Bart's friendship with Milhouse Van Houten is the show's definitive portrayal of childhood friendship, specifically of the kind of childhood friendship where one person is clearly more dynamic than the other, and the friendship persists anyway because the bond between them is more than role. Milhouse is, by any conventional measure, a disaster. He is anxious, sensitive, physically unimpressive, romantically fixated on Lisa in a way she finds somewhere between touching and exhausting, and perpetually in situations he was not equipped to handle. He follows Bart into things he knows are bad ideas, because the alternative not following Bart is unthinkable to him. Bart, for his part, drags Milhouse into these bad ideas with a combination of genuine affection and complete obliviousness to Milhouse's feelings about it. He loves Milhouse the way people love friends they have had since before they were capable of choosing friends strategically, completely, not always considerately, but without any question that the love is real. The episodes where their friendship is threatened, where some external pressure or internal tension brings them to the edge of a break, are always resolved, because the show understood that breaking Bart and Milhouse would break something essential in the show's emotional ecosystem. Nelson Muntz occupies a different role in Bart's social world, the intimidating figure who became a friend by proximity and stayed a friend through a process that neither of them would be able to fully explain. Nelson's background, glimpsed in various episodes across the show's run, is one of the darker backstories the show maintained for a minor character. His parents are absent in ways that range from neglect to outright abandonment. He has raised himself largely in a house that may or may not have his mother in it, depending on the episode and the degree to which the writers were playing his domestic situation for laughs or for pathos. He is the school's primary source of menace and also, quietly, one of its most isolated residents. The episodes that explored Nelson's interior life, the ones that stepped back from his function as a threat and looked at him as a child growing up without adequate support in a town that was not paying close enough attention, were some of the show's most effective uses of a supporting character. Nelson's laugh, his famous ha-ha, aimed at other people's misfortunes, takes on a different quality when you know that the laughter is one of very few emotional responses he has been allowed to develop freely. Bart's criminal adventures, the stunts, the pranks, the schemes that occasionally crossed from mischief into genuine illegality, were always the show's most gleefully chaotic material, and the best of them had a particular quality of inevitability. As though Bart was not choosing to do these things so much as being chosen by them, as though the sequence of events that led from a Tuesday afternoon at Springfield Elementary to some enormous civic disaster was simply the natural result of a specific kind of energy meeting, a specific kind of opportunity. The prank calls to Moe's Tavern were almost ritualistic Bart calling, requesting a patron by a name that was a pun, Moe announcing the name to the bar, Moe realizing the joke, Moe threatening violence he would never commit. This sequence played out dozens of times across the show's run, and each time it had the comforting quality of a ceremony observed. The show's most ambitious explorations of Bart as a character were the episodes that found something real in him that the pranks had been covering. The Season 3 episode Bart the Murderer, where Bart accidentally becomes involved with Fat Tony's mob operation, revealed Bart's genuine talent for social navigation, his ability to read situations and people that his classroom performance completely obscures. The Season 4 episode Bart Gets Famous, where Bart achieves accidental celebrity through the catchphrase, "I didn't do it," traced with real sadness the way fame simplified him, reduced the full complexity of who he was into a single, repeatable gesture, and how he both wanted the recognition and resented the reduction. The Cape Fear episode Sideshow, Bob's most famous reappearance, gave Bart the full hero treatment of classic thriller structure, placed him against a genuinely menacing villain whose hatred for him was operatic in its elaborateness, and let Bart be fully, genuinely scared. The fear was not played for comedy in the way that Bart's discomfort often was. It was played as what it was: a child being stalked by an adult who wanted to kill him, and the episode's final resolution, Sideshow Bob being compelled to perform the entirety of the HMS Pinafore in exchange for enough time for the houseboat to reach civilization, is one of the most glorious comedy payoffs in the show's history, but it sits atop genuine dread. His relationship with Lisa is perhaps the most honest sibling relationship in television fiction. They are different in essentially every way that siblings can be different. Different intelligences, different emotional styles, different relationships to the social world, different relationships to their parents, different visions of what the future might look like. They do not always like each other. They compete, they bicker, they occasionally deploy their knowledge of each other's weak points with the precision only available to people who have been sharing space since birth. And they are, underneath all of that, deeply loyal. The episodes where one of them needs the other really needs the other, not in the manufactured crisis sense, but in the sense of genuine distress, are always resolved with the sibling stepping forward without the melodrama, simply being there, because they know each other too well to do otherwise. Bart's future has been glimpsed in various flash-forward episodes across the show's run, and the picture those episodes paint is consistently interesting and not always what you might expect. He becomes, in some visions, a lawyer which tracks with his verbal facility and his comfort in adversarial situations. He becomes a failure, in some visions, the kid who peaked in childhood and could not find the adult equivalent of his particular gifts. He becomes, in the most famous of the flash-forwards, a directionless man in his 30s who is still finding his way while Lisa has already found hers. What all of these futures share is that Bart is recognizable in them. He is still Bart, still impulsive, still charming, still operating somewhere adjacent to the rules while maintaining the argument that he is fundamentally in compliance with them. The kid survives into the man. The 10-year-old remains visible inside whatever adult configuration he eventually settles into, which is, in the end, what we hope for ourselves and the people we love, not that they become unrecognizable, but that the essential thing remains. Bart Simpson is 10 years old, and he has been 10 years old since 1989, and he will be 10 years old for as long as the show runs. And there is something in this particular permanence that feels right for him. 10 is the age of maximum possible daring, the age before self-consciousness fully develops, before the social world's expectations begin to constrain what you are willing to attempt. At 10, you can still skateboard off a roof and believe that the landing will work out, because you have not yet accumulated the evidence that it will not. Bart at 10 is Bart at full power, and Springfield would not be Springfield without him. Section 5. Lisa Simpson, the loneliest genius in television history. Lisa Marie Simpson is 8 years old. She plays the alto saxophone with a proficiency that would be remarkable in a professional musician and is entirely inexplicable in a child growing up in Springfield. She has won awards for essays, competitions for science projects, and the grudging, complicated respect of everyone in her family who is capable of providing it. She reads at a level the school's standardized tests cannot adequately measure. She cares about the world, specifically about its animals, its environment, its political structures, its distribution of justice and injustice with an intensity that exhausts the people around her and sustains her through an isolation that would break most children. She is, to be direct about it, the most emotionally sophisticated character in the show's main cast. Not the funniest, though, she is frequently very funny, with a wit that tends toward the elegant and the precise. Not the most charismatic, though she has her moments of genuine warmth, but emotionally sophisticated, which is to say she understands herself and others with a clarity and depth that the show treats as both her greatest gift and her most constant source of suffering. Lisa's intelligence was established from the beginning as the kind that creates distance. In Springfield Elementary, where the educational aspiration is essentially to produce functional citizens, Lisa's abilities place her so far outside the norm that her classmates relate to her the way they might relate to a benign alien presence respectfully, from a distance, with the vague sense that the expectations of direct engagement are beyond their current capacity. She does not have friends at school, not really. She has classmates who are not hostile to her. The distinction matters enormously to Lisa, and the show respected it by not pretending the distinction away. She is lonely. The show never let her not be lonely. Even in episodes that gave her a temporary friend or a fleeting sense of belonging, the underlying loneliness was maintained. Because it was structural, it was the result of being who she was, in a world that was not built for who she was, and no individual friendship could fix that. What individual friendships could do was give her respite from it, temporary warmth in the space of one relationship, and the show used these episodic friendships beautifully, with the understanding that they were comfort rather than solution. Her saxophone is the most consistent outlet for her inner life, and the show's writers and composers treated it seriously. Lisa plays in the show's musical world at a level that goes beyond competence into genuine expression. The instrument gives her access to a form of communication that does not require the people around her to meet her at her level. Music bypasses the requirement for intellectual parity. She can play and be heard and felt without anyone needing to understand what she is saying, which is the particular mercy that art provides to people who otherwise struggle to be understood. She took up the saxophone in circumstances that the show depicted. In a lovely early episode, she encountered a jazz musician, Bleeding Gums Murphy, playing alone under a bridge, and recognized in the music something that she had been trying to find a language for. Bleeding Gums Murphy became her musical mentor, an older figure who treated her as a musician rather than as a child musician, and the relationship between them, conducted largely in the language of the music itself, was one of the show's earliest signals that it could do emotional register beyond comedy. When Bleeding Gums Murphy died, in the 5th season episode that announced the show's willingness to take loss seriously, Lisa's grief was real and the show honored it. She arranged for his last album to be played on the local jazz station. She said goodbye to him properly. And the saxophone became, from that point forward, a slightly different instrument in her hands. Not just expression but memorial. Not just pleasure but tribute. Her relationship with Bart is the sibling relationship we described in his section, but experienced from her side of it, the dynamic looks somewhat different. She is frequently the more patient one, the one who steps back from a conflict to assess it rather than immediately escalating. She is frequently the target of his mischief, with a consistency that could breed genuine resentment and instead breeds a kind of weary affection, the affection of someone who has decided that the person causing them difficulties is still worth the difficulty. Her love for Bart is real, and it is occasionally, when the show gave it room to breathe, very moving. With Homer, she has the most asymmetrical relationship in the family. She is profoundly aware of who he is and what he is not, and she loves him anyway, in the specific way that children who see their parents clearly still manage to love them. The gap between Lisa's intellectual world and Homer's is wide enough that they have almost no meeting ground in terms of ideas, and the show was honest about this. They could not talk about most things together. What they could do was exist in affection together, sit in the same room and be glad of the other's presence, and the show found that this was enough. Some of the show's most affecting moments were the quieter Homer and Lisa episodes, not the grand gestures and the last-minute rescues, but the smaller things. Homer attending her school recitals without understanding the music and applauding with genuine pride. Lisa noticing, in a moment of private observation, that Homer has done something thoughtful he did not think she saw. The episode where he carried her down the mountain. The episode where she wrote him a card that he kept and read when he thought no one was watching. Her relationship with Marge is the most consistently nurturing relationship she has, and it is the relationship that comes closest to meeting her needs. Marge listens. Marge does not always understand everything Lisa is saying, but she listens with the full weight of her attention, and for Lisa, who is used to being half-heard, this full attention is profound. Marge also, when necessary, advocates for Lisa in the family and in the wider world, and she does it without the performative anxiety that sometimes attaches to parental advocacy. She simply does it because it is right. Lisa's political consciousness developed early and has been the source of some of the show's most pointed social commentary. Her vegetarianism adopted in the Season 7 episode, Lisa the Vegetarian, was a genuine commitment that the show maintained consistently afterward. One of the few character developments across the show's run that stuck. Her environmentalism, her animal rights advocacy, her opposition to Springfield's various civic corruptions, her complicated relationship with a democratic process that does not reliably produce just outcomes. All of these gave the show a mouthpiece for views that were clearly taken seriously by the writers, even when the show's comedy asked her to be impractical or strident in her expression of them. The show's treatment of Lisa's intelligence underwent a subtle evolution across its run. In the early seasons, her intelligence was mainly used to position her outside the family's chaos. She was the one who understood what was happening, whose explanations provided the viewer's orientation to the plot, whose reactions to Homer's decisions registered as intelligent assessment. As the show matured and the writers grew more confident, they began using Lisa's intelligence more complexly, exploring the ways it isolated her, the ways it came with costs as well as benefits, the ways it was sometimes counterproductive, the ways it occasionally expressed itself as arrogance or inflexibility. The episode, Lisa the Simpson, addressed the fear passed down by Grandpa Simpson that all the Simpsons eventually become stupid as they age, that the intelligence Lisa currently possesses will decline over time as some genetic inheritance asserts itself. Lisa faced this possibility with genuine terror, and the show's resolution of the episode was interesting. The Simpson gene that causes intellectual decline, it turns out, only affects men. Lisa will be fine. But what stays with the viewer is not the resolution, it is Lisa's fear during the episode, the raw vulnerability of a child who has built her entire identity around her mind, contemplating what she would be without it. Her relationship with faith and religion gave the show some of its most thoughtful material. The episode where Lisa converted to Buddhism, at least to the degree that an 8-year-old in Springfield can be said to convert, was handled with a seriousness unusual for American animated television. The show had a genuine conversation about the appeal of a philosophical and spiritual tradition that emphasizes mindfulness and compassion, and it let Lisa find in it something real. The conversion, like the vegetarianism, became a permanent aspect of her character. She did not revert. She remained, in the show's world, a Buddhist, and her practice of it was treated with respect. Lisa's relationship with her future has always been one of the show's most poignant ongoing threads. In the flash-forward episodes, she has become a senator, a secretary of state, the first female president of the United States. She has become a professor, a writer, an activist whose causes eventually change things in small and real ways. The futures are varied in their specifics but consistent in their underlying shape. Lisa grown is Lisa as she always was, but given room to become the person the small version was already aiming toward. She is, in these futures, still a little lonely. Still reaching towards something the world has not quite arranged to provide. But she is doing it from a position of achieved purpose, which is a particular kind of happiness, and the show honored this. What makes Lisa Simpson singular among television characters, and she is singular, there is no other character quite like her in the medium, is the consistency with which the show refused to make her satisfaction cheap. She wanted so much, and so much of what she wanted was genuinely important, and the world she lived in was so consistently inadequate to her desires, and she kept wanting anyway. She kept playing the saxophone. She kept writing the essays and attending the town meetings and raising her hand in class, even when the raising of her hand produced no result except momentary exposure to her classmates' indifference. This is a portrait of idealism maintained against evidence, and it is, in the right mood and the right light, one of the most moving things the show ever depicted. The world did not deserve Lisa Simpson. Springfield certainly did not. And she stayed in Springfield, and she kept caring about it, and she kept trying to make it better, because that is who she was, and the alternative to stop caring, to give up on the possibility of improvement, was not available to her. The caring was structural. It was who she was. That is Lisa, the loneliest genius in television history, still 8 years old, still reaching for the saxophone, still raising her hand, still hopeful in the specific stubborn way of someone who cannot stop being hopeful, even when the returns are poor. Section 6. Mr. Burns: A Century of Power, Poison, and Survival. Charles Montgomery Plantagenet Schicklgruber Burns, known to Springfield as Mr. Burns, known to his nuclear power plant employees as the person who cannot remember their names, known to his personal physician as a medical impossibility, known to the English-speaking world as the most fully realized fictional villain in American animated television. Burns is, depending on which episode you encounter him in, either the most frightening or the most pathetic character in the show's cast. The genius of his characterization is that both of these assessments are always simultaneously true. He is old. This is perhaps his most fundamental quality, and the show has leaned into it with a consistency that has produced some of its richest material. How old is Burns? The honest answer is that the show has never fully committed to a number, and the inconsistencies in his biographical timeline are considerable even by the show's generous standards of continuity. But the broad shape is clear. Burns was born in the late 19th century. He has personal memories of events that occurred before the turn of the 20th. He has described the Gilded Age, the period of American industrial excess that ran roughly from the 1870s to the turn of the century, not as history but as experience. He attended Yale. He served in World War II, where he acquired a $1 trillion bill from the United States government through means the show implies were not entirely conventional. By the most conservative reading, he is well past 100. By the most ambitious, he has been alive for closer to 130 years. And in all that time, he has not mellowed. This is crucial. Burns is not the curmudgeon who softens. He is not the miser who discovers generosity. The Christmas Carol template, the one that the show explicitly invoked in the episode Simpsons Roasting on an Open Fire, which was the show's first broadcast episode, is present in Burns's characterization, but inverted. He is Scrooge, yes, in terms of the structural archetype, but unlike Scrooge, Burns has been offered transformation many times and has consistently chosen his current form. He has had moments of apparent human connection and abandoned them. He has had relationships with Smithers, with the specific woman he fell in love with once, with the memory of a childhood teddy bear named Bobo that carried genuine emotional weight and did not ultimately change him. He chooses to be what he is. This makes him scarier than most fictional villains, who are usually presented as people who could not have become otherwise. Burns could have become otherwise. He chose not to. The early biography of Charles Burns is one of the show's most fascinating unexplored territories. He came from money, old money, the kind that predates most American institutions, the kind associated with land and industry, and the particular moral flexibility that sustained both of those things through the 19th century. The Burns family fortune was, by the time Charles inherited it, already enormous, already ancient by American standards, already the kind of wealth that has ceased to be about any particular commodity and has become simply about the maintenance of itself. He was, as a young man, apparently human in ways that his current form has largely abandoned. There are glimpses across the show's run of a younger Burns, not warm exactly, but recognizable as a person with appetites and preferences and the capacity for attachment. The episode that showed his childhood Bobo, the teddy bear he lost as a boy and spent decades attempting to recover, was the show's most explicit acknowledgement that something human had once existed inside the figure who now stalked Springfield's civic landscape. The attachment he had to that bear, the depth of his need to recover it, the specific quality of his relief when he finally did suggest it a child who had experienced enough loss that a stuffed animal had become the container for everything he could not afford to feel about the losses themselves. His relationship with his family is presented in fragments across the show's run, and the fragments are dark. He had parents who were apparently present but not, in any meaningful sense, warm. He had siblings, one of whom a brother or a half-brother, The details shift became the subject of a late-season episode that played the family reunion with characteristic ambivalence. Burns does not reminisce about his family with fondness. He reminisces about them the way a person revisits the conditions that made them who they are, with a mixture of understanding and something that falls short of forgiveness. He attended Yale, where he studied the show implies something in the neighborhood of business and law, the Victorian-era equivalents of the frameworks that justified monopoly power as natural and beneficial. He emerged from this education with his existing instincts refined and his existing capacity for ruthlessness given institutional vocabulary. He entered the world of industry at a time when the American economy was actively rewarding the kind of behavior that later legislation attempted to constrain, and he thrived. The Springfield nuclear power plant was not his first business, and it was not his first exercise in the particular kind of power that comes from being the primary employer in a captive community. But it is the business that defines him in Springfield's civic life, and the nature of that business, the provision of electricity, the most fundamental modern utility, to an entire town, with the ability to cut that provision at will, gave him a kind of leverage over the community that no other character in the show's history possessed. How Burns is kept alive is one of the show's most intriguing ongoing threads, handled mostly in asides and throwaway lines that accumulate into something substantial. The most explicit account came in the Springfield Files episode, where the aftermath of his weekly medical treatment left him glowing green in the woods, so saturated with whatever the treatment involved that his body emitted visible light. The treatment kept him alive for exactly 1 more week. Without it, he would die. This was presented as Comedy Burns as accidental alien, but the underlying information was not funny. It was the portrait of a man whose body had been so fundamentally compromised by age and radiation and whatever chemical regimen his physicians had developed to manage both, that he now required external intervention on a weekly schedule to maintain basic biological function. The doctor's assessment of Burns's medical situation, delivered in the famous Three Stooges syndrome scene, is taken seriously. Among the most alarming medical portraits ever rendered in comedy, Burns has every known disease simultaneously. Every disease. They are all present in his body at the same time, and the only reason none of them has killed him is that they are all competing for the opportunity simultaneously, and each prevents the others from gaining dominance. He is the sickest man in America, and he is functionally indestructible because everything that would kill him is being blocked by everything else that is also trying to kill him. This creates a kind of medical equilibrium that is not health, not in any meaningful sense. It is the absence of death rather than the presence of life. Burns persists. He does not thrive. He persists through a combination of enormous wealth, advanced private medical infrastructure, Smithers's meticulous management of his treatment schedule, and a biological stubbornness that the show presents as morally continuous with his character stubbornness. He will not die because he has decided not to, and he has the resources to impose that decision on his own body. Wayland Smithers is the most important character in Burns's life, and their relationship is one of the show's most interesting and most discussed ongoing storylines. Smithers is Burns's personal assistant, his chief of staff, his scheduler, his medical coordinator, and in the psychological reading that the show made increasingly explicit across its run, the person who loves Burns most completely and most hopelessly in the world. The nature of Smithers's feelings for Burns was handled with a complexity that was genuinely unusual for American television in the 90s, when the show's relationship with the dynamic was established, and the show maintained that complexity across the decades as cultural contexts shifted. Smithers loves Burns. This is not ambiguous within the show. It is depicted with clarity and consistency. The nature of that love, whether it is romantic, whether it is paternal, whether it is some form of devotion that does not map cleanly onto conventional categories, is left somewhat open, which is one of the ways the show kept it interesting. What is clear is that Smithers's world is organized entirely around Burns's existence. His satisfactions are Burns's satisfactions. His distress is Burns's distress. He derives his sense of purpose entirely from the management of Burns's needs, and the question of what Smithers would be without Burns to organize himself around is one that the show occasionally gestured at and then retreated from, because the answer was uncomfortable. Burns, for his part, does not love Smithers. He is attached to him in the specific way that people become attached to infrastructure they depend on, but attachment and love are not the same thing, and Burns is not a character who confuses them. He values Smithers the way he values his weekly treatment as a necessary component of the system that keeps him alive and functional. When Smithers has been absent from Burns's life in various episodes, Burns's response has been practical rather than emotional. He missed the services, not the person providing them. And yet, there are moments, small ones, easy to overlook, where Burns's response to Smithers carries a hint of something more than utility, a moment of recognition, a moment where the old man's absolute certainty about his own indifference to human connection flickered very briefly into something ambiguous. The show never fully committed to what these moments meant. It left them as what they were, glimpses into the possibility that somewhere inside the most consistently dehumanized figure in Springfield, something continued to resonate. Burns's relationship with Homer is the structural axis of the show's working-class dimension. Homer works for Burns. He has worked for Burns for the entirety of his adult life. He earns from Burns the salary that pays the mortgage on 742 Evergreen Terrace, that feeds the family, that keeps the lights on. Burns cannot remember Homer's name with any consistency, despite decades of employment, despite Homer's role in events significant enough that most employers would commit the responsible employee to memory. Homer's name has been, across the show's history, Don, Norm, Grimmer, Homer Q, and various other substitutions, each more wrong than the last. The comedy of this ongoing failure of recognition is obvious, but the thing underneath the comedy is not funny. Burns's inability to remember Homer's name is not an accidental quirk. It is a deliberate characterization choice that illuminates the nature of the power relationship between them. Burns does not need to remember Homer's name, because Homer is, in Burns's framework, interchangeable. He is not a person with a name. He is a unit of labor in a sector that Burns owns. The name is irrelevant to the function. Remembering it would require Burns to extend Homer the basic human recognition of individuality, which is the one thing the structure of their relationship does not require. There was, however, a deal. The deal between Burns and Grandpa Simpson, brokered in secret, maintained in silence, never revealed to Homer, was the show's most explicit acknowledgement that Burns's ownership of Homer was not simply economic. Grandpa had discovered evidence of a crime Burns committed. Burns bought his silence with a promise. Homer would always have a job at the plant, regardless of performance. This is why Homer, despite 742 documented errors and essentially no period of sustained competence, was never permanently terminated. Not because Burns forgot to fire him. Because Burns was legally obligated to retain him, by an agreement Homer never knew existed. This means that Homer's entire working life, the 30-plus years of stumbling into the plant in his blue jumpsuit, pressing the wrong buttons, eating donuts during meltdown warnings, sleeping at his workstation, has been underwritten by a secret his grandfather made with the man who destroyed his family. Homer works for Burns because his grandfather made a deal with Burns. He does not know the deal exists. He is the subject of an arrangement he has never consented to and cannot escape because he does not know he is in it. If there is a thesis statement hidden in the deepest layer of Homer's relationship with the plant, it might be this. The working life of a man in Springfield's particular economic ecology is not freely chosen, even when it appears to be. The structural constraints that determine where Homer works and on what terms were established before he was old enough to choose, by forces whose interest in him was not his flourishing but their own. He is not an employee. He is, in the most technical sense, a dependent, a person whose security is provided on terms determined by someone else, maintained for someone else's reasons, revocable in ways he does not have full information about. And he goes to work every day anyway. He goes to work because the family needs the income, because the alternative is worse, and because somewhere in the part of Homer's brain that still functions despite everything, the work, even this work, even at this plant, even for this man, is what he has. It is the shape his days take. It is the place he returns to, even having left it many times. It is, in its own strange way, his. Burns's civic influence extends well beyond the plant. He has bought politicians, defunded community organizations, redirected city services toward his interests and away from the communities, blocked legislation, avoided taxation, and generally maintained his position at the top of Springfield's power structure with the thoroughness of someone who has had more than a century to get it right. The town's democratic institutions, the mayor, the city council, the police, the courts, all function within the gravitational field of Burns's wealth. oriented toward outcomes that leave his interests intact, regardless of what the nominal democratic process has decided. This is not a conspiracy. It is not particularly hidden. It is simply the way the town works. And everyone in Springfield understands it at some level, even if they rarely name it directly. The show depicted this with a kind of exhausted clarity, not with outrage, but with the weary familiarity of a community that has made its peace with a structural situation it cannot change. Burns is 100 and some years old, and he will be alive next season, and the one after that, and the one after that, because the system he has built, the medical system, the financial system, the civic system has been designed specifically to ensure his continuity. He does not have the biological immortality of a myth. He has something more modern and arguably more frightening. He has infrastructure. He is not a villain, the way that story villains are usually villains driven by a specific grievance or a specific desire that can be denied and thereby neutralized. He is a villain the way that systems are villains, which is to say he is a villain that does not require malice, because the power dynamics do the work on their own, because the structures he has built continue to function, whether he is awake or asleep, attending his weekly treatment or wandering in a green glow through the Springfield woods, and yet he is. Beneath it all, beneath the institutional power and the medical infrastructure and the 100+ years of accumulated ruthlessness, a man. A very old, very sick, very damaged man who sleeps alone in a mansion built for someone with more warmth than he has ever allowed himself, and who owns a childhood teddy bear that he needed more than anything in the world, and who has, perhaps, somewhere in the machinery of his kept-alive body, a trace of the boy who lost it. The show was generous enough to show us that trace. It was honest enough not to pretend it changes anything. Section 7. The supporting cast. Springfield's hidden depths. Springfield is more than 5 people on a couch. It has always been more. The richness of the show's world, the reason it has sustained itself across 36 seasons without exhausting its possibilities, is largely attributable to the supporting cast, the recurring characters who populate the background of every episode and occupy its foreground when the main family steps aside. These are people with histories, with damage, with aspirations that the show depicted with a care and consistency that rewarded long-term viewing in ways that individual episodes could not always convey. Ned Flanders is perhaps the most complex character in the supporting cast, which is not the obvious thing to say about a man whose primary mode is cheerful religious niceness. But Ned's niceness is not simple, and the show knew it was not simple from early on, and the episodes that explored what was underneath it were some of the most emotionally sophisticated things the show ever attempted. He was born to parents who were beatniks, free-spirited nonconformists, who rejected the authority structures of the 1950s with a thoroughness that extended to their parenting. They did not believe in discipline. They did not believe in behavioral correction. Young Ned was uncontrollable. Genuinely, so the show depicted a child who was feral in the specific way of children given no structure and no limits, whose energy had nowhere to go but outward and destructive. His parents eventually took him to a psychiatrist who treated Ned's behavior through intensive behavioral modification, a years-long process that suppressed his aggressive impulses so effectively that they were not merely managed but buried. The Ned who emerged from this treatment was almost excessively well-behaved, excessively patient, excessively forgiving, because the alternative, feeling the rage that the treatment had driven underground, was not available to him. His niceness was not natural. It was engineered. Understanding this changes every scene Ned has ever been in. His patience with Homer's noise, his trespassing in Ned's yard, his casual appropriation of Ned's tools and time and goodwill is not the patience of a saint. It is the behavioral product of a system designed specifically to prevent Ned from expressing what he actually feels. He is not choosing to be patient. He cannot choose otherwise without the cage his therapy built beginning to crack. And when the cage does crack, when the hurricane destroys his house, and the community's rebuilding effort is so inadequate that the new structure collapses immediately, the person who emerges is not the rage that the therapy suppressed. Exactly. It is the grief. It is every loss Ned has absorbed without being allowed to grieve it, emerging all at once in a torrent that the show treated with genuine compassion. His wife Maud's death caused by a t-shirt cannon at the Springfield Speedway, which Homer had been dodging when the shirts hit Maud instead, which sent her over the railing to her death on the track below, was the show's most significant loss of a recurring character and was handled in 2 distinct registers. The episode immediately following established the practical reality of Ned's widowhood, the domestic reorganization required by the sudden absence of the person who had been managing half of every day. The emotional weight was built up across subsequent seasons in the quieter moments. Ned's continued presence at church, his halting attempts to re-enter romantic life, his relationship with his two sons, Rod and Todd, in the absence of their mother. Rod and Todd Flanders are two of the show's most quietly affecting minor characters. Raised in an environment of sincere religious devotion and Ned's managed niceness, they are gentle, earnest, slightly fearful children who navigate Springfield Elementary with the particular vulnerability of kids who have been too carefully protected to develop defenses. They are afraid of a considerable number of things: secular music, television content, the neighborhood generally, and they approach the world with a wariness that makes perfect sense given how it has already treated their family. The friendship between Ned and Homer is the show's central philosophical argument, expressed through plot rather than dialogue. They are the show's thesis and its antithesis, sitting next to each other on the same street for 36 years, never resolving into a synthesis because the show was honest enough to recognize that some opposites do not resolve. Ned does everything right and is punished for it. Homer does everything wrong and is rewarded for it. Or more precisely, Homer does everything wrong, and the love around him persists anyway, which is its own kind of reward. The gap between them in terms of effort, discipline, morality, and outcome never closes. It cannot close. Springfield is not a place where effort and outcome have a reliable relationship. Moe Szyslak is the show's most fully realized portrait of a specific kind of working-class male despair. He runs Moe's Tavern with a dedication that would be impressive applied to a business with any genuine future, and the show has made clear across its run that Moe is not unaware of the grimness of his situation. He is not self-deceived. He knows exactly what kind of man he is and what kind of place his bar is, and what that means for his prospects. He holds this knowledge with a dark, self-lacerating humor that prevents it from becoming simply depressing, and transforms it instead into the particular comedy of radical honesty about things most people prefer not to see clearly. He has tried, across various episodes, to escape the gravity of his situation. He has entered romantic relationships that briefly seem to offer him something different. He has attempted to upgrade the bar's status by rebranding it. He has revealed, in various glimpses of his backstory, a past that was more complicated than his present suggests. Childhood dreams, early ambitions, paths not taken. None of these have changed his fundamental position, which is behind the bar at Moe's, serving drinks to a recurring cast of regulars, taking Bart's prank calls, and maintaining in the face of persistent evidence to the contrary the possibility that things could still get better. His loyalty to Homer is one of the more touching elements of his character. It is not sentimental. Moe is not a sentimental person, but it is genuine. Homer and Moe have been friends in the particular way of people whose friendship is mostly about proximity and habit and the shared daily practice of showing up at the same place. And that kind of friendship, the show understood, is not lesser than more elaborately constructed ones. It is in some ways more durable. Principal Seymour Skinner, or the man known as Principal Seymour Skinner, whose actual name is Armin Tamzarian and whose true identity was revealed in the controversial Season 9 episode, is a character who carries a particular weight of institutional authority that the show has been undermining systematically since the beginning. As the principal of Springfield Elementary, he is the face of the educational system that produces the town's children. That he is himself a kind of elaborate fiction, a person living inside a borrowed identity, gives his institutional role a dimension that is either deeply sad or quietly funny depending on your orientation. The Tamzarian reveal remains one of the most debated creative decisions in the show's history, and the reactions to it illuminate something interesting about how audiences relate to fictional characters. Viewers objected, very intensely, to the revelation that Skinner was not who he had appeared to be. They felt betrayed. They felt that the show had invalidated something real. But what this reaction actually demonstrated was that Skinner, across the episodes leading up to the reveal, had become a fully realized character whose history mattered to the audience independent of whether that history was accurate. They loved him as Skinner. The revelation that he was Tamzarian felt like theft. His relationship with his mother Agnes is, under the Tamzarian reading, even more complex than it appears. Agnes believes her son died in Vietnam. She has accepted Armin Tamzarian as her replacement, has organized her remaining life around a fiction, and appears not to want this disturbed. The codependency between them, the adult son who cannot leave the parental home, the mother who reinforces every limitation while demanding every service, is the show's most sustained dark comedy, and it runs entirely on the foundation of a lie that both of them have agreed to maintain. Superintendent Chalmers, who descends on Springfield Elementary periodically in a bureaucratic fury and departs having achieved essentially nothing, is the show's portrait of institutional oversight, the kind that exists primarily to produce the appearance of accountability rather than its reality. He is not a bad person. He is not corrupt in the Burns sense. He is simply a man whose institutional function is so thoroughly captured by the mechanics of that function, the inspections, the reports, the meetings, that actual change is never quite what gets produced. His relationship with Skinner is a comedy of sustained deception, with Skinner presenting the most favorable possible interpretation of Springfield Elementary's catastrophic reality, and Chalmers accepting these interpretations with a willingness that suggests he prefers them. He does not want to know. Knowing would require him to act, and acting would require resources and authority he does not have and would not know how to deploy if he did. The inspection visits are theater. Both men know it. Neither man says it. Chief Clancy Wiggum is the show's portrait of law enforcement at its most benevolently incompetent. He is not cruel. He is not corrupt in any particularly active sense. He takes things from crime scenes and ignores the occasional law, but this is presented as the casual thoughtlessness of a man who has never seriously considered that the rules apply to him rather than as systematic malfeasance. He is simply not good at his job, in a comprehensive way that encompasses planning, observation, evidence management, interviewee conduct, use of force, community relations, and essentially every other component of effective policing. His son Ralph Wiggum is the show's most reliably surreal minor character, a boy who exists somewhere adjacent to consensus reality and whose statements, delivered with complete conviction, have no consistent relationship to the observable world. Ralph is not stupid. Exactly, the show never quite committed to that explanation. He is simply elsewhere, cognitively, in ways that are never explained and that the show found more interesting to leave mysterious. He is delightful. Springfield Elementary would be significantly less interesting without him. Dr. Julius Hibbert is the show's most consistent medical presence, not the only doctor in Springfield, as Dr. Nick Riviera provides an alternative and considerably less reputable option, but the one who operates as the actual medical establishment. His laugh is the show's most reliable signal that something catastrophic has just been confirmed. He laughs at bad news with a specificity that suggests not callousness but the developed coping mechanism of someone who has spent decades delivering bad news to Springfield's uniquely radiation-adjacent population. The laugh is defensive. It is the laugh of a man who has processed too much suffering to respond to any individual instance of it with the appropriate gravity. Sideshow Bob Robert Underdunk Terwilliger, Ph.D., is the show's most elaborately conceived villain, in the sense that he is a villain whose villainy is inseparable from his cultural sophistication, his theatrical self-presentation, his genuine intelligence, and the specific, elaborate, and repeatedly foiled nature of his primary obsession, killing Bart Simpson. He was Krusty the Clown's sidekick, then betrayed Krusty, went to prison, escaped or was released, and from that point forward organized his considerable talents around the project of revenge against the child who exposed him. This is not a sensible allocation of a remarkable intelligence, and Bob knows it, and the show's best Sideshow Bob episodes were always the ones that examined the gap between what he could have been and what he chose. He quotes Gilbert and Sullivan. He quotes Shakespeare. He references 19th century literature with the ease of someone who spent his formative years in the most excellent educational institutions money could provide. He is genuinely, comprehensively cultured, and he has dedicated this culture to an extended attempt to murder a 10-year-old. The comedy of this disproportion was the show's primary joke about him, but the show also knew that the joke had a pathos underneath it. Bob is wasted. Whatever he might have done with his life, and the show occasionally sketched possible alternative trajectories, moments when Bob was briefly living something other than his obsession, he did not do it. He chose Bart. He keeps choosing Bart. His family, the Terwilliger family, introduced in later seasons when Bob's relatives became recurring characters, added a dimension to his backstory that the show handled with characteristic comedic density. The Terwilligers are a family of sophisticated criminals, intellectually gifted villains who bring the same cultural refinement to their malevolence that Bob brings to his. The family context reframes Bob somewhat. He is not an aberration, but a product, someone whose particular gifts were cultivated in a particular environment and found their expression in a particular direction. Fat Tony Marion Anthony D'Amico is Springfield's organized crime presence, and he is drawn with the very specific comedy of a man who takes the theatrical conventions of his profession entirely seriously. He is a mob boss in a town that does not have enough of a criminal economy to fully justify a mob boss. He operates with the dignity and formality of a figure from a serious crime narrative in a context that cannot quite sustain that seriousness, and the mismatch is consistently funny without diminishing him. He has loyalty. He has a code. He is not Burns. He does not use institutional power to destroy families. He simply runs the criminal economy of Springfield with professional thoroughness and a certain weary dignity. Grandpa Abraham Simpson Abe is the show's portrait of old age in its least sentimental form. He is in the Springfield retirement castle, which the show depicts with some darkness as an institution of managed irrelevance, a place where the old are warehoused out of sight of the people who deposited them there and told that this is love rather than convenience. Abe is aware of this arrangement. His response to it alternates between the rambling, disconnected storytelling that is his most immediately recognizable mode and moments of clear-eyed bitterness that break through the folksy persona. His stories are famous for their digressiveness, their factual unreliability, and their tendency to arrive nowhere in particular through routes that make no geographic sense. But they are also, occasionally, the vehicle for genuine history, not just Abe's personal history, but the show's history, the backstory of Springfield's families across generations. He was there for things that shaped the present. He has connections to historical events that the show deployed with characteristic casualness, dropping significant revelations into the middle of monologues that begin about something else entirely and end without resolution. He was not a good father to Homer. The show was honest about this without being sensationalized about it. He was distant, emotionally constrained, given to harsh assessments of Homer's character and capacity that Homer internalized in the way children internalize their parents' assessments, even when those assessments are wrong. He lied to Homer about his mother's death for decades, which is perhaps the single most significant act of parental dishonesty in the show's run. He made a deal with Burns that bound Homer's working life without Homer's knowledge or consent. And yet Homer loves him, visits him at the retirement castle, listens to the stories, sits with him in the particular way of adult children who love their difficult parents, not because the difficulty has been resolved, but because the love predates it and outlasts it. This is among the show's most honest emotional observations. Krusty the Clown Herschel Schmoikel, Pinchas Yerucham Krustofsky, is the show's portrait of entertainment industry cynicism, a man who performs happiness for children while feeling essentially nothing that happiness could be confused with. He drinks, he gambles, he has terrible relationships with everyone in his life, including his professional collaborators, his audience, and his own family. He is a bad person by the metrics of any specific decision he makes, and yet he is also, unmistakably, a person someone whose failures have the texture of failures, rather than the clean lines of cartoon villainy. His relationship with his father, Rabbi Krustofsky, voiced in the original appearance by Jackie Mason, was the show's most explicitly Jewish family drama, and it handled with genuine care the particular pain of a child whose professional choices created an irreparable rift with a parent whose love came with conditions the child could not meet. Krusty became a clown because that was what he loved. His father could not accept a clown as a son. The estrangement lasted until Bart and Lisa reconciled them in one of the show's earlier heartfelt resolution episodes, and the reconciliation was moving in the specific way of stories about estrangement that ends not because the underlying difference has been resolved, but because both parties have decided that the love is more important than the disagreement. Homer's colleagues at the nuclear plant, Lenny Leonard and Carl Carlson, are among the show's most consistently present minor characters, and their presence creates a social context for Homer's working life that the episodes set exclusively at the plant often depended on. Lenny and Carl are Homer's friends in the full sense. They have been friends since before the show started, they have history together, they show up for each other in the particular low-key way of working-class male friendship, which does not often involve grand gestures, but involves showing up every day and making each other laugh. Their relationship with each other has been, across the show's run, the subject of its own occasional speculation. The show deployed their mutual devotion in ways that periodically suggested something beyond ordinary friendship, without ever fully resolving the question. They are devoted to each other. Their lives are organized around each other's presence in ways that most friendships are not. The show was content to leave this as what it was, which is to say it was content to leave it as the most significant relationship either of them had, and to treat that significance with the same quiet dignity it brought to other kinds of love. Springfield is, in the end, all of these people together. It is the Simpsons at the center, and Ned Flanders next door, and Moe behind the bar, and Skinner in the school, and Wiggum at the station, and Krusty on the television, and Grandpa at the retirement castle. It is the Springfield we know because we spent enough time in it to learn all of its residents, not just the main family. And that breadth, that willingness to populate the world with people who were real enough to love is the source of the show's deepest staying power. Section 8. The Golden Era Seasons 3 through 8, Story by Story. If Springfield has a mythology, the Golden Era built it. The seasons from 3 through 8, running from 1991 to 1997, represent the period when the show was operating at a height that television comedies rarely reach and almost never sustain. They were the seasons when the writers were confident enough to take genuine emotional risks, when the animation had developed a visual vocabulary that could carry mood as well as comedy, when the voice cast had settled so completely into their characters that the performances carried weight beyond the lines. They were the seasons that most people mean when they say The Simpsons, the episodes they quote and reference and return to and defend. Going through them story by story, at the slow, unhurried pace that these episodes deserve. Season 3 opened in 1991 and immediately signaled that the show had ambitions beyond its first 2 seasons' domestic comedy. Stark Raving Dad, the first episode of the season, brought Michael Jackson, uncredited, as a guest voicing a large white man in a mental institution who claimed to be Michael Jackson. Homer encounters this man after being briefly committed following a workplace incident, befriends him, brings him home, and the episode builds to a moment where this stranger, Leon Kompowski, by name, a bricklayer from New Jersey who adopted the Michael Jackson persona as a form of self-expression, helps Bart write a birthday song for Lisa that arrives exactly on time and exactly perfectly. The comedy of Michael Jackson's uncredited cameo was considerable. The emotional content of the episode, the gentle treatment of mental illness, the portrait of a man who had found in an elaborate persona something that let him connect with the world, was the show announcing what it intended to be. Homer introduced a concept that would become central to the show's mythology. The idea of Homer's extreme incompetence leading to accidental success, with the particular horror that this success was then attributed to skill. When Homer accidentally prevents a nuclear meltdown by hitting the correct button at random, he is celebrated as a hero and used as an inspirational example in communities across the country. He knows he was lucky. The world insists he was capable. The episode ended on the question of what happens to a person when the gap between their reputation and their reality is too wide to bridge, and it left the question open. Bart the Murderer, in which Bart accidentally gets involved with Fat Tony's mob organization after a mishap with his skateboard, was the show discovering that its peripheral characters could carry a full narrative when given the room. Fat Tony and his associates were funny, yes, but they were also fully realized presences, and the episode's exploration of Bart's complex response to the attention and respect that came with mob adjacency was psychologically precise. Homer at the bat, where Mr. Burns attempts to win a softball championship by recruiting Major League Baseball players to the power plant team, is one of the show's greatest comedy constructions. 9 Major League players, each sidelined by a different absurd injury or circumstance before the game, with Homer's amateur contribution ultimately deciding the outcome. The joy of the episode is in its architecture, the systematic elimination of each professional player through escalating unlikely circumstances, and in Homer's genuine pleasure at being, however briefly, the one who mattered. Dog of Death used the family's financial crisis following Santa's Little Helper's expensive medical treatment to examine the way money pressure changes family dynamics, the way financial scarcity forces choices that reveal priorities in unflattering ways. It was a domestic drama of real sophistication, resolved with emotional honesty. Season 4 is perhaps the most mythologically important season in the show's history, for reasons that extend beyond any individual episode. It was the season when the show's identity crystallized most clearly, when the balance between comedy and emotion was most precisely calibrated. and it was the season that produced many of the episodes most frequently, cited as the show's definitive achievements. Homer the Heretic, the season premiere, is one of the most audacious episodes the show ever attempted. Homer decides to stop going to church, and the episode takes this decision seriously enough to have Homer encounter God in a dream and engage in what is essentially a theological conversation about the nature of faith and obligation. The God of the Simpsons universe is an unusual deity, pragmatic, conversational, slightly bureaucratic, and his discussion with Homer about whether a man is obligated to worship in a building has a genuinely interesting logic to it. The episode resolves with Homer's house catching fire and the community, including, pointedly, people of several different faiths arriving to help. The conclusion is not that Homer was wrong to question. It is that community has value independent of the institutional structures that organize it. Lisa the Beauty Queen, where Homer enters Lisa in a beauty pageant to improve her self-confidence, works entirely on the strength of the emotional relationship between Homer and Lisa, and on the show's understanding that Homer's love for Lisa was one of its most reliable sources of genuine feeling. His motivation, noticing that Lisa was unhappy with how she looked and wanting to fix it, was pure Homer in both its instinctive kindness and its poor methodology. Treehouse of Horror 3, the third annual Halloween special, included the Kang and Kodos sequence and King Homer, the King Kong parody, and Dial Z for Zombie, and represented the show at its most playful with genre, with horror iconography, with the particular comedy of applied absurdism. The Treehouse episodes occupy their own space in the show's mythology, disconnected from continuity, freed from the emotional weight of the ongoing stories, pure in the particular way of material that does not need to mean anything beyond what it is. Marge versus the Monorail, written by Conan O'Brien, who was on the writing staff before becoming a television host, is the episode that defines the show's satire of civic politics and community gullibility most perfectly. A slick con man arrives in Springfield, spins an irresistible pitch for a monorail system the town does not need, wins the town meeting, takes the money, and leaves a disaster behind. The satire of how communities can be convinced to vote against their own interests through charisma and false urgency is pointed and precise. The episode is also, and this is not incidental, one of the funniest 30 minutes of television ever produced. Last Exit to Springfield, the Season 4 episode where Homer becomes the power plant union president during contract negotiations and accidentally becomes a labor movement hero through incompetence, is widely considered one of the best episodes of any television show in any genre. Its script, its pacing, its visual comedy, its emotional content, and its political sophistication are all operating at levels that rarely coexist in a single piece of television. Homer's labor negotiations with Burns, conducted through mutual misunderstanding across a table that both men are using to play out entirely different dramas, are comedy writing of exceptional craft. Whacking Day, where Springfield celebrates an annual holiday involving the ritual killing of snakes, revealed to be a holiday invented in the 1920s as an excuse for mob violence against the Irish, is the show's most direct satire of tradition and cultural authority, of the way communities invest customs with meaning that cannot survive examination. The episode's environmental subtext, Lisa's sympathy for the snakes, Homer's enthusiastic participation in the killing, the eventual revelation that the holiday was manufactured, was characteristic of the show's approach to ecological issues in this era. The front, where Bart and Lisa write itchy and scratchy scripts under Grandpa's name, gave the show an opportunity to satirize its own industry with insider knowledge, and the satirical portrait of the animation business it produced was sharp enough to sting. A Streetcar Named Marge, discussed at length in Marge's section, and Homer's Barbershop Quartet, where Homer's youthful membership in a briefly successful group called the B Sharps was revealed in a beautiful Beatles parody, both combined narrative ambition with emotional honesty in ways that felt genuinely earned. Season 5 built on Season 4's foundation, with a series of episodes that pushed the show's ambition in new directions. Homer's Barbershop Quartet, wait, that was Season 5, not 4. And the distinction matters because Season 5's run included some of the show's most expansive storytelling. Cape Fear, the Sideshow Bob episode structured as a direct parody of the Cape Fear films, is the show's most successful sustained suspense comedy, using the conventions of thriller filmmaking to create genuine menace while simultaneously undermining those conventions with increasing absurdity. The scene in which Sideshow Bob steps on every single rake in the rake-lined yard once, twice, a dozen times, until the joke has been carried so far past its logical conclusion that it has passed through funny and emerged somewhere beyond comedy into something stranger, remains one of the show's defining moments. Homer Goes to College, where Homer enrolls in the nuclear science curriculum required for his safety inspector certification and encounters college culture with the enthusiasm of someone who has seen too many movies about. It is funny in the specific way of Homer applying fictional templates to real situations with complete sincerity. His understanding of college comes entirely from Animal House-style comedies, and his attempts to live out those templates in an environment that is not interested in them has the particular Homer quality of cheerful wrongness. Rosebud, the episode that introduced Bobo, Burns' childhood teddy bear, is the most humanizing treatment Burns ever received, and it works because the show was precise about what the bear represented. It was not sentiment being used to soften Burns' character. It was sentiment being used to establish that Burns was once a person capable of attachment, and that the person he became was the result of loss rather than absence of feeling. He lost Bobo. He lost the capacity for uncomplicated affection. He spent a century accumulating power as a substitute. When Maggie found the bear inside an ice cream bag and refused to give it up an infant, holding her ground against the most powerful man in Springfield, the episode's conclusion was genuinely moving in its specific way. Marge on the Lam, where Marge and her neighbor, Ruth Powers, develop a Thelma and Louise-inspired friendship, was the show taking genuine pleasure in the friendship between two adult women, which was rarer in animated television than it should have been. Bart's Inner Child, featuring the motivational speaker Brad Goodman, who adopts Bart's philosophy of pure impulse and teaches it to the town, with predictably catastrophic results, is the show's most direct satire of self-help culture and its particular brand of therapeutic permission to be exactly who you currently are. Season 6 gave the show its most famous cliffhanger in Who Shot Mr. Burns? But it gave the show so much else before that finale episode. Bart of Darkness, where Bart, confined to his room with a broken leg, becomes convinced through a Rear Window-style paranoia that Ned Flanders has murdered Maude. Balanced comedy and genuine suspense. Lisa's Rival, where a new student, Allison Taylor, challenged Lisa's position as the smartest child in Springfield Elementary, explored the complexity of Lisa's relationship to her own superiority, the way she needed to be acknowledged as the best without being able to fully enjoy it when challenged. Another Simpsons clip show. Every show did a clip show, and this one used them more creatively than most. Homie the Clown, where Homer attended clown college and was then mistaken for Krusty by the mob, had one of the show's most reliable comic structures, the case of mistaken identity escalating to the point of genuine threat, resolved through the particular absurdity of Homer's specific skills. Bart vs. Australia, where Bart's prank call to an Australian boy led to an international diplomatic incident, was the show's international satire at its most gleefully committed. The episode's portrait of Australia and Australian culture was filtered entirely through American cultural assumptions, which was the point, and the show's willingness to commit to the joke with the full weight of its storytelling machinery was characteristic. Homer vs. Patty and Selma, where Homer's financial crisis put him at the mercy of Marge's sisters, mined the dynamics of extended family obligation with real precision. A Star is Burns, the crossover episode where Jay Sherman from The Critic appeared, was the occasion for one of the show's most publicly documented pieces of creative friction, as Matt Groening reportedly objected to the crossover and had his name removed from the episode's credits. And then the cliffhanger. Who Shot Mr. Burns? Part 1 ended the season with every character having motive, with Burns having caused maximal damage to the community, with the shooting itself rendered in the specific visual language of mystery fiction. The summer that followed was, for fans of a certain vintage, a genuine shared cultural experience, the period when the show was a national conversation rather than a niche enthusiasm. Season 7 brought the resolution, brought Sideshow Bob's most operatic appearance in Sideshow Bob's Last Gleaming, brought Mother Simpson, the show's greatest emotional achievement in this era, Homer reuniting with his mother and then watching her drive away again in the knowledge of why she had to go, brought 22 short films about Springfield, which was one of the show's most formally inventive episodes, a series of connected vignettes examining the lives of Springfield's supporting characters in compressed, self-contained miniatures. The episode proved that the supporting cast could sustain the show on their own weight, that the world of Springfield was rich enough that you could follow any thread and find something worth examining. Homer's Phobia, where Homer befriended a gay antiques dealer and then panicked about the possibility that the man's friendship might be affecting Bart's developing identity, was one of the show's most direct engagements with cultural attitudes toward gay people, and it handled the subject with more nuance than most primetime television of the era managed. Season 8, the last season most people cite as uniformly excellent, gave the show You Only Move Twice, possibly the single most beloved episode in the show's history, in which Homer accepts a job at a new company run by the charming and competent Hank Scorpio, who turns out to be a supervillain in the tradition of Bond films. The episode works on the level of comedy, on the level of Homer's professional flourishing for the first time in his career, on the level of the family's resistance to leaving Springfield, and on the level of the satirical portrait of charismatic management and its uses. Homer is, at Globex Corporation, genuinely excellent. He is good at the job, he is appreciated, he is seen. He loses all of this to return to Sector 7G because the family needs Springfield even when Springfield is not quite right for them. The Homer They Fall, where Homer discovered a physical ability to absorb punishment and became a professional boxer, managed by Moe, was the show at its most absurdist about Homer's physiology, but also one of its most touching explorations of the friendship between Homer and Moe. Burns, Baby Burns, where Burns's illegitimate son, Larry Burns, arrived in Springfield, explored what a more human version of Burns might have looked like, with mixed results, but with genuine feeling in the moments that counted. Bart After Dark, where Bart was sent to work at a local burlesque house, balanced the show's comfort with pushing boundaries against its genuine respect for the adult characters it introduced. A Millhouse Divided, where Kirk and Luann Van Houten's divorce became the occasion for Homer and Marge to examine the health of their own marriage, was one of the show's most emotionally honest depictions of what a long marriage actually requires, what work it involves, what it looks like when that work is not being done. This is the era that defined the show. These are the stories that people carry with them. When someone says The Simpsons was great once, this is what they mean. And it was great. It was genuinely, irreplaceably great. Section 9, Springfield's Darkest Episodes, The Lore Beneath the Laughs. The Simpsons was always a comedy. It was always, in every episode and across every season, primarily committed to making people laugh. But the greatest comedy frequently touches something below laughter, reaches through the comic surface into the material beneath. And what the show found beneath its comedy across 36 seasons was, sometimes genuinely dark. Not dark in the way of horror or violence. Dark in the way of real human sadness, the kind that comes from loss, from failure, from the recognition of limits, from the particular helplessness of caring about people you cannot protect from the things that will hurt them. The show's darkest episodes are not its scariest or its most uncomfortable. They are its most honest. The ones where the comedy became transparent, and through it you could see the underlying human truth without decoration. Mother Simpson has been mentioned, but it deserves its own extended treatment in this section because it is the show's darkest episode in the most fundamental sense. It is dark not because of anything dramatic or violent, but because of what it contains. Homer finds his mother. He has her, briefly, in his life 27 years of absence compressed into a few days of presence that are all the more precious for being so obviously temporary. She has to leave again. She drives away in the night, as she drove away in his childhood, and Homer sits on a hill and watches her taillights disappear, and the scene holds on him, sitting there alone, long past the point where a comedy show would typically cut away. The episode ends without a joke. It ends with Homer, sitting with his loss, in the specific quality of silence that the show produced only when it meant it. Homer lost his mother twice. The second time was different because he knew it was happening. He could see her driving away, and he could not stop it, and he knew exactly what it meant. The first time, he was sleeping. This second goodbye was awake, and aware, and terrible in a way that the first was not. The episode And Maggie Makes Three, the flashback episode that revealed the story of Maggie's birth, is another of the show's great emotional achievements. It began as the story of Homer's happiest year. He had paid off the house and left the plant and taken his dream job at a bowling alley, and for the first time in his adult life, he was exactly where he wanted to be, doing exactly what he wanted to do. And then Marge became pregnant with Maggie, and Homer had to return to the plant, had to take back the job he had finally escaped, had to stand at the desk where Burns had hung the sign, "Don't forget, you're here forever," and make it into something he could live with. What Homer did was take the photographs of Maggie that he had been keeping in his wallet, the wallet pictures that most parents carry, the ones too small to fully see the person they represent, and he covered the sign with them. "Don't forget, you're here forever" became, with Maggie's photographs placed over specific letters, "Do it for her." The reveal of this, at the episode's end, is one of the most quietly devastating things the show ever did. Homer is still at the plant. He will always be at the plant. And he has made this bearable by turning the most permanent reminder of his constraint into a portrait of his reason for accepting it. Lisa's Substitute, the early season episode where Lisa developed an intense attachment to a substitute teacher, Mr. Bergstrom, and then had to watch him leave at the end of his assignment, is one of the show's most precise explorations of the specific pain of loving someone who is passing through your life. Mr. Bergstrom was everything Lisa needed. He saw her clearly, engaged with her seriously, treated her intelligence as a resource rather than an inconvenience. His departure was not cruel. It was simply the consequence of a temporary posting ending. But it was devastating in the particular way that temporary things are devastating when they are the first version of something you needed permanently. The note he wrote Lisa before leaving, "You are Lisa Simpson." 5 words that function as a complete affirmation of identity and worth, was read as corny by some viewers and understood as profound by others, and the difference between those readings says something about what you carry into the episode with you. Lisa needed to be told she was Lisa Simpson, that her particular identity, the intelligence, the sensitivity, the commitment to things that mattered was not a problem but a foundation. She needed to be told this, and she was told it, and then he was gone, and she had only the note. Alone again, natura diddly. The Ned Flanders episode where Maude died handled grief with a seriousness unusual, even for this show at its most serious. The mechanics of the death were absurd t-shirt canon, Homer dodging the shirts hitting Maude, which was in keeping with the show's aesthetic. But the grief that followed was not absurd. Ned's disorientation, his attempts to navigate the immediate practical demands of death while simultaneously comprehending that his wife was gone, his relationship with his sons in the immediate aftermath, these were drawn with care and precision, and the kind of observational honesty that only comes from writers who understood something about loss from the inside. Homer's Enemy Season 8 is the darkest episode the show ever made from a character study perspective, and it made some people very uncomfortable for reasons that are worth examining. A new employee, Frank Grimes, arrives at the power plant. Grimes is competent, diligent, qualified, and completely unable to comprehend how Homer Simpson, incompetent, careless, essentially uncertifiable, has arrived at the life he has. Grimes has worked for everything he has. Homer has been given everything he has not worked for. Grimes cannot accept this disparity, and the episode traces his escalating inability to accept it, ending in his accidental death at his own moment of greatest breakdown. The darkness of the episode is not in the death. It is in what the episode is actually saying. Frank Grimes' worldview, the worldview that effort produces reward, that merit determines outcome, that life should make sense in the way that hard work and qualification and responsible behavior should be rewarded, is not wrong, exactly. It is simply inadequate to Springfield. Springfield does not work that way. Homer does not have his life because he deserved it. He has it through luck and love and the accumulated goodwill of people who chose to stay. Grimes cannot survive in a world that does not honor his framework. The episode ends with his co-workers laughing at his funeral, and the laugh is genuinely uncomfortable, and it is supposed to be. Homer is living his best life in a world that should have destroyed him. Frank Grimes, who did everything right, is dead. The show offers no resolution to this disparity. It simply shows it to you and lets you sit with it. The Treehouse of Horror episodes occupy a special category in the darkness discussion. They are darkness for fun, the show's annual permission to be as frightening and violent and morbid as it wanted to be outside the constraints of the canonical universe. But the best of them were dark in ways that landed differently from conventional horror that used the familiar Springfield characters to explore fears more intimate than the supernatural. The episode in the first Treehouse special, where the family is killed one by one in a haunted house and ends up perfectly happy as ghosts, was a gentle meditation on what a family would look like if released from the anxieties that organize their living. The episode where Homer sold his soul for a donut and the devil turned out to be Flanders explored moral philosophy through comedy without losing either the philosophy or the comedy. Hurricane Nettie, where Ned's breakdown occurred, has already been discussed in his section, but its place in this section is also secured. The episode was dark in the way of psychological truth, in the portrait of a man discovering that the pleasant surface of his personality was a constructed thing, that the person underneath had needs and rages that had never been properly acknowledged, and that the process by which those qualities had been suppressed had cost him something he could not recover just by knowing the cost. Bart sells his soul. Season 7 is one of the show's most quietly philosophical episodes. Bart, as a prank, sells his soul to Milhouse for $5. The premise is treated as a joke, but the episode takes the concept of the soul seriously enough to explore what it would mean to not have one. Bart begins noticing that things feel different without it. He cannot laugh at things that used to make him laugh. Animals that used to like him no longer respond to him. There is a quality missing in his experience of the world that he cannot name but can feel the absence of. The episode is the show asking, through comedy, what it is that makes a person legible to themselves and to others, and suggesting that the answer involves something more than the biological. Behind the laughter, the Season 11 mock documentary was the show at its most meta, depicting the Simpson family as real people who had been the subjects of a television show called The Simpsons, and examining the ways that family fame had damaged them individually. The episode played with the conventions of the VH1 behind the music format with exceptional precision, and the portrait of the family that emerged, particularly the Homer that emerged, the one whose excesses and hubris had nearly destroyed everything, was darker than anything in the canonical universe, because it was the version of the family stripped of the cartoon protection that usually kept consequences from fully landing. Lisa the Iconoclast, where Lisa discovered evidence that Springfield's founding father, Jebediah Springfield, was not the hero. The town's mythology made him out to be explored. The show's themes around collective belief and comfortable lies in one of their most direct forms. Lisa found documentary evidence that Jebediah Springfield was actually a pirate, a murderer, a fraud. The town's entire identity was organized around the story of Jebediah's heroism. And Lisa, in the course of the episode, discovered something that complicated her relationship to the truth that the lie was doing important work, that the community needed its founding myth in ways that the truth could not replace, and that revealing the historical evidence would cost the town something real in exchange for something abstract. She chose to suppress the evidence. She chose the community's need for its story over her own commitment to factual accuracy. And the show treated this as a real moral choice, not a failure of integrity, not a betrayal of Lisa's principles, but a sophisticated recognition that truth and community are not always in alignment, and that the choice between them is sometimes genuinely difficult. The darkness of these episodes, taken together, forms a consistent philosophical position that runs beneath the comedy of the entire show. Springfield is a town where things go wrong. People are hurt. Loss is real. Justice is imperfect at best and frequently absent. Effort is not reliably rewarded. The community has dark corners it prefers not to illuminate. Individual human beings carry damage they did not choose and cannot fully repair. And yet the show never became nihilistic. It was always, in every dark episode, still reaching toward something: connection, understanding, the possibility that two people who love each other can find their way back to each other through whatever has complicated the distance between them. The darkness was never the point. It was the context that made the love legible, the background against which the moments of genuine warmth and genuine comedy stood out with their full force. That is the tension at the heart of the show's deepest material. Things are sad and also funny and also real and also important and also temporary. And the temporary quality does not undermine the importance, and the sadness does not undermine the love. Springfield is a broken place full of people who love each other imperfectly and keep trying anyway. The show's darkness is inseparable from its hope, which is the most honest thing it ever said about being human. Section 10. The mythology of Springfield. Its history, its secrets, its soul. Every long-running fictional world accumulates a mythology. Not the mythology of gods and heroes in the classical sense, but the mythology of a place's own understanding of itself, the stories a community tells about its origins, its values, its significance, and its future. Springfield has one of the richest such mythologies in American fiction, assembled across 3.5 decades of storytelling, and exploring it is the work of this final section. Springfield was founded by Jebediah Springfield, or so the official history maintains. The name he was actually born with, as Lisa discovered and then suppressed, was Hans Sprungfeld, and his biography before arriving in what would become Springfield was considerably less heroic than the civic mythology allowed. He was a man of the 18th century American frontier, which is to say he was someone whose survival depended on capacities that later generations would prefer to locate in villains rather than founders. He was violent, pragmatic, and not particularly attached to the truth when convenience suggested a different account. The story of Springfield's founding that the community tells is organized around Jebediah's heroic qualities, his courage, his vision, his selfless commitment to the community he was building. There is a giant statue of Jebediah in the town square that is polished, maintained, and annually commemorated on Jebediah Springfield Day. The statue is also, Lisa discovered, wearing a silver tongue, because Jebediah's real tongue was bitten off in a fight with a pirate, and the community's relationship to this historical detail, the elaborate physical denial built into the founding monument, is itself a small allegory for the show's broader theme of preferred narrative over documented fact. Springfield's industrial history centers on the nuclear power plant, but the plant was not always the primary employer. The town had an earlier economic life organized around different industries, and glimpses of this earlier life appear in various episodes' depictions of the town's history. There were factories. There was agriculture in the surrounding county. There was whatever economic activity sustained the retirement castle and its predecessors before the plant became the gravitational center of the town's economic life. The plant's construction and the conditions under which it was built are largely unexamined in the show's mythology, which is itself significant. Burns's acquisition of what would become one of the most unsafe nuclear facilities in fiction is not depicted in detail. The regulatory environment that permitted it to operate with 342 violations is not explored. The history of the facility before Homer's tenure as safety inspector, the period during which all of those violations were accumulating, is left as backdrop. What we know is the present state of the plant: dangerous, inadequately maintained, staffed by a safety inspector who has been physically and cognitively compromised by the very environment he is supposed to be monitoring. The town's relationship with celebrity is one of its most distinctive mythological qualities. Springfield has been visited by an improbable number of famous people across the show's run, and the community's relationship to these visitors has a consistency that reveals something about Springfield's self-conception. The town is alternately starstruck and suspicious, eager to claim the validation of famous attention, and resentful of the reminder that the world outside its borders has more glamour than it does. Famous people in Springfield are always somewhat out of place. This is the comedic motor of most celebrity guest episodes, and the dissonance between the celebrity's world and Springfield's world is always productive. The towns where Springfield exists simultaneously, the geographic impossibility discussed in the predictions section, are also part of its mythology. Springfield can be everywhere because it is trying to be America, and America is not a single place. The America that Springfield represents is the interior of American consciousness about itself, the self-image, the aspirations, the contradictions between stated values and actual practice. In this interior America, the nuclear plant and the bowling alley and the quickie mart and the tire fire and the monorail that should never have been built and the mayor who should never have been elected all coexist, not because they make geographic sense, but because they make psychological sense. They are all things American communities contain. The founding families of Springfield are another layer of the mythology. The Simpsons are newcomers. In historical terms, they arrived in Springfield within the living memory of the older residents. The families who have been in Springfield longer include the Van Houtens, the Lovejoys, the Flanders clan, and various others whose connection to the town predates Homer's birth. The texture of a community that has multiple generations of residents is present in the show in subtle ways, the way that towns actually work when some families have been there for generations, and others are always the newcomers regardless of how long they have been there. The underworld of Springfield Fat Tony's organization, the various criminal enterprises that operate in the margins of the town's official life, has its own mythology, its own codes, its own institutional history. The show deployed this world with characteristic care when it engaged with it directly, treating the mobsters as people with professional standards and professional pride even while using them for comedy. Fat Tony's world operates by rules, and the collision between those rules and Springfield's other institutional rules produces the particular comedy of incompatible codes of conduct applied to the same situations. The supernatural dimension of Springfield's mythology deserves extended attention because the show was more willing to engage with genuine weirdness than it is usually credited with. The Treehouse of Horror episodes established a tradition of supernatural engagement, but the supernatural was also present in the canonical universe in more subtle ways. God is real in Springfield. The show depicted God directly in several episodes, in a form that was partly comedic, pragmatic, slightly overwhelmed by the scale of his administrative responsibilities, but whose existence was not presented as uncertain. Springfield exists in a universe where God exists. It also exists in a universe where the devil exists. Ned Flanders has played the devil in at least one episode, and the comedy of this casting depends on it feeling somehow right. The universe of Springfield is one where the terms of Christian mythology are more or less operative, even if the specific institutions of that mythology are depicted with satire. The mythology of the Simpson family itself is the deepest layer of the show's world-building. 3 generations, Abe, Homer, and the children living in the same town, employed by the same employer, connected to the same web of civic relationships, each generation shaped by the damage done to the previous one. Abe's emotional unavailability shaped Homer's desperate need for love. Burns's pursuit of Mona shaped Homer's motherless childhood. Homer's impaired cognition and emotional neediness shaped the environment in which Bart, Lisa, and Maggie grew up. The family is a history, and the history is a story about what happens when the systems around a family fail them. But the family is also a survival story. Despite everything, despite the plant and Burns and the radiation and the poverty and the absent grandmother and the lying grandfather and the floating timeline that prevents any of them from growing up, the Simpsons persist. They sit together on the couch. They eat together at the kitchen table, usually something Marge has cooked that Homer is eating without tasting, and Bart is eating without gratitude, and Lisa is eating around the animal products. They watch television together in the living room. They argue and reconcile and fail each other, and show up for each other, and carry each other through the specific and ordinary disasters that constitute a family life. The mythology of the show is, ultimately, the mythology of the family. Of the nuclear family both in the contemporary sense and, given the plant, in the slightly more literal sense as the organizing unit of American life, the place where the abstractions of society and culture and economics become personal and particular. The show examined this unit from every angle across 36 seasons. It found it ridiculous and beautiful and fragile and indestructible. It found it a vehicle for comedy and for tragedy and for something that exists between the two. The specific mood of people who love each other without quite being equipped to love each other, who keep trying anyway because the alternative is not trying, and that is worse. Springfield's soul, if a fictional town can be said to have a soul, is that particular quality of persistence. Not triumphant persistence, not inspirational persistence in the Hollywood sense. Everyday persistence. Getting up and doing the day again. Returning to the couch at the end of it. Watching the television. Being together in the imperfect, unresolved way of families who have not fixed all their problems because the problems are not the kind that get fixed, only the kind that get lived with, day after day, in the ongoing presence of love that is imperfect and real and enough. That is Springfield. That is what 36 seasons and nearly 800 episodes and 4 hours of slow, careful, attentive exploration of this fictional town comes down to. A family, a couch, a television, the blue of the night through the living room window. The particular quality of being home, even in a home that is not ideal, even in a town that is not safe, even in circumstances that a more reasonable universe would not have produced. Homer stumbles through the door. Marge looks up from whatever she is doing with an expression that contains everything she does not say. Bart is doing something on the stairs that will become a problem later. Lisa is in her room, playing something on the saxophone that the house is not quite big enough to contain. Maggie is in the playpen, watching everything with those enormous eyes, understanding more than anyone knows. And outside, the cooling towers of the plant hum in the dark. The Quickie Mart is open. Moe is behind the bar. Ned Flanders has said his prayers and turned off his lights. The streets of Springfield are quiet in the way they always are at this hour, which is a late hour, which is the hour that comes just before sleep, which is where we are now, somewhere at the edge of Springfield, at the end of a long, slow walk through the whole of it, The houses are dark, the town is quiet. The family on Evergreen Terrace is what they always are, imperfect, and together, held in the particular amber of a show that chose 36 years ago to press pause and has never quite pressed play again. And that is fine. That is more than fine. Because some things are worth preserving. Some families are worth keeping exactly as they are, in the version of themselves where the kids are still small and the marriage is still intact and the door is still going to open at the end of the day and everyone is going to sit down together. Press pause on Springfield. Let it stay exactly like this. You have been in very good company tonight. Thousands of people, across many time zones and many kinds of nights, settled in with this the same way you did. That is its own quiet miracle. The way a place this fictional can gather this many real people around it in the dark. Thank you for spending 4 hours in Springfield. The show will be here tomorrow and the day after and the night after that whenever you need it. Section 11. The episodes that changed everything. Deep dives into the show's pivotal moments. There are episodes in a television show's history that function differently from the others. Not necessarily the funniest, not always the most celebrated, but the ones that shifted something, that introduced an idea or a character or a tonal register that the show could not have existed without afterward. These pivotal episodes are worth sitting with individually, with the full attention that their significance deserves, because understanding them is understanding how the show built itself into what it became. The very first broadcast episode of The Simpsons, Simpsons Roasting on an Open Fire, which aired on December 17, 1989, is not the first episode in production order, but it is the first episode that most of the audience ever saw, and the decisions it made about how to introduce the family have a foundational quality that rewards close reading. The episode begins at a school Christmas play, which is the show establishing immediately that it will use the institutional life of Springfield, the school, the civic events, the communal gatherings as context for the family's story rather than restricting itself to the domestic interior of the house. Homer discovers that his Christmas bonus will not arrive because Burns has canceled it this year, which is already the show establishing the power dynamic between the plant's owner and its workers in its very first episode. The detail that Burns canceled the Christmas bonus is not incidental. It places the family's financial precarity in a specific structural context. They are poor because the man who employs Homer is rich and has decided to keep more of the money that Homer's labor produces. The show's first Christmas crisis is caused by capital. Homer takes a second job as a department store Santa to raise money for Christmas gifts. His training for this role is a sequence of exceptional comedy, the veteran store Santa performing his duties with the practiced hollowness of a man who has done this too many times to invest anything genuine in it, while the new trainees attempt to absorb the mechanics of Santa performance. Homer is earnest. He brings to the role the same complete sincerity he brings to every role the show gives him, and the sincerity is both what makes him lovable and what makes the episode's emotional core work. He is trying so hard, with such inadequate tools. He takes Bart to a greyhound race to try to supplement his Santa earnings, and Bart chooses a dog named Santa's Little Helper, who comes in last. The owners of the dog, disgusted by the loss, abandon him on the track. Bart pleads with Homer to take the dog home. Homer, who has no money for Christmas, who has failed at the job he took specifically to provide Christmas, who is returning home to a family he has disappointed, says yes. He says yes because Bart needs this. He says yes because some things are more important than being practical. He says yes because Homer, at his best, is someone who says yes to the things that matter even when saying yes costs him something he cannot afford. The family opens the door to find Homer and Bart with the dog instead of presents, and the moment in which they understand what has happened, the moment in which the absence of gifts is replaced by the presence of this dog, this thin, disheveled greyhound who is already wagging his tail at the warmth of the house, was the show announcing what it was going to be. It was going to be funny, yes. It was going to be satirical, but it was also going to reach for moments of genuine warmth, and it was going to treat those moments seriously, and it was going to earn them through the comedy rather than using comedy to avoid them. Santa's Little Helper has been a member of the Simpson family since that first broadcast episode, and his presence across 36 seasons is its own minor mythology. He is a terrible dog. By most practical standards, he has escaped from the yard countless times, has eaten things he should not, has required expensive veterinary intervention, has been the occasion for episodes that explored what the family owed him and what the limits of animal ownership looked like when the animal's needs exceeded what the family could manage. But he is their dog. He is the original gift. He is what the first Christmas of the show gave the family when the money ran out. Bart the General, the fourth episode to air in the first season, introduced the relationship between Bart and Nelson in its original adversarial form before the later seasons complicated it into something more. The episode's treatment of bullying as a systemic problem requiring systemic solutions, Bart ultimately defeats Nelson not through individual victory, but through organizing the other kids who have also been victimized, was unexpectedly sophisticated for a show that had been on the air for a handful of weeks. Moaning Lisa. The sixth episode of the first season is the episode most frequently cited by serious critics of the show, as the moment when they understood what kind of show this was actually going to be. Lisa is depressed. Not cartoon depressed, not dramatically depressed, but in the specific and recognizable way of a child who feels that the world around her does not have a place for who she is. She encounters Bleeding Gums Murphy, plays the saxophone with him in the middle of the night in Springfield's version of the French Quarter, and finds in the experience something that language could not have given her. Marge tries to help and initially gives her bad advice smile. Even when you don't feel like it. The world goes better when you pretend and then walks it back, tells Lisa that she is allowed to be what she is, that her feelings are real and she does not have to perform something different. The retraction of the bad advice is the most emotionally honest moment in the first season. The Telltale Head, the seventh episode, gave Bart a story organized around a genuine moral crisis. He decapitated the town's statue of Jebediah Springfield to impress bullies, and the episode traced his attempt to deal with the consequences with a seriousness that the premise's absurdity did not undercut. The episode's most interesting beat was the moment when Bart, carrying the severed head through Springfield, encountered the community's genuine grief at the loss of the statue, and understood that the symbol meant something to people beyond its literal form. The statue was not Jebediah Springfield. Jebediah Springfield was not what the statue represented anyway. What the community had lost was the story they told through the statue, and the loss of that story hurt them in ways Bart had not anticipated. Homer's Night Out, the 10th episode, built the season's first extended examination of Marge's inner life around a photograph of Homer dancing with an exotic dancer at a bachelor party, which Bart circulates through Springfield. The episode explored the particular degradation of a private moment becoming a public spectacle, and Homer's attempts to explain himself to Marge, and then to the dancer whose image was being circulated, gave the show its first real engagement with the dynamics of objectification and dignity. Moving into the second season, Bart gets an F. The premiere has been mentioned in Bart's section, but its significance as a season opener deserves elaboration. Opening the second season with an episode about academic failure and the terror of falling behind, about the specific humiliation of a child who knows he is disappointing the adults around him and cannot seem to prevent it, was a declaration about the show's priorities. The jokes were present, but the emotional content was the organizing principle. The cry that Bart had at the end, "Teacher, have you ever been to one of those special schools?" was played completely straight. And it worked because everything before it had been built to support it. 2 cars in every garage and 3 eyes on every fish. The fourth episode of Season 2 introduced the 3-eyed fish Blinky and organized the entire episode around Burns's attempt to manage the political fallout. The episode is a perfect miniature political satire, but what makes it significant in the mythology is Blinky himself, the 3-eyed fish, pulled from the river near the plant, the first visible evidence that the plant's contamination was affecting the biological life of Springfield in documentable ways, the evidence that Burns ate on camera to prove it was fine. Blinky is one of the show's most enduring background images, appearing as a symbol of Springfield's contamination across multiple subsequent seasons. He was the first visible mutation, and the town's response concern, then managed reassurance, then forgetting established the template for how Springfield handles evidence of its own damage. Bart vs. Thanksgiving, the 7th episode of Season 2, is one of the most underappreciated episodes in the show's history. A Thanksgiving story organized around a family argument that captures the specific texture of holiday dinners with extended family better than almost any other piece of American television. Bart destroys Lisa's centerpiece and refuses to apologize, and the episode traces the specific psychology of a child who knows he was wrong and cannot bring himself to say so, who would rather run away from home than capitulate to the social requirement of apology. His night wandering the streets of Springfield, ending up at a homeless shelter where he helped serve food for a local news piece, is simultaneously the episode's comedy and its emotional content, and the resolution Bart apologizing, but on his own terms, in a private moment on the roof with Lisa rather than in front of the assembled family, is exactly right. Blood Feud. The 22nd episode of Season 2, the season finale, gave Burns the blood transfusion story and then, in its final scene, did something that the show would return to across its entire run. It acknowledged the absence of tidy resolution. Homer does something that should result in reward, does not receive the reward, and the episode ends with the family sitting together asking what the moral of the story was and agreeing that there wasn't one. This was the show announcing that it was not interested in the kind of storytelling that arrived at lessons. Life did not arrive at lessons. The family would sit with the unresolved situation the way families actually sit with the unresolved situations that constitute most of their experience together, and that would be enough. Season 3's Like Clown, the Krusty and His Father episode structured a reconciliation story around the specific cultural and religious dynamics of the Krustovsky family with a care that the show did not always bring to stories. Involving cultural specificity. The reunion between Krusty and Rabbi Krustovsky was facilitated by Bart and Lisa through the application of Talmudic passages, which was both a joke and a completely sincere engagement with the logic of the father's position. Rabbi Krustovsky had religious reasons for his estrangement from his son. Bart and Lisa found religious reasons for reconciliation. The show treated this symmetry as intellectually valid and not merely comic. It respected the father's framework enough to engage with it on its own terms, and that respect was what made the resolution feel earned. Flaming Moe's, where Moe stole Homer's secret drink recipe and built a successful bar around it, explored the dynamics of intellectual property and friendship, and the particular bitterness of watching someone else profit from your idea, but it also explored something more specific to Homer's character, his complicated relationship to recognition. Homer invented the drink. Moe used it to achieve exactly the kind of success that Homer had never managed and never would manage. And Homer's grief was not only about the theft. It was about the demonstration that the success was possible, that if someone else had the idea, it could work, and that Homer simply was not the person who could execute it, that the genius in the moment of invention could not be sustained into the long work of building something. Colonel Homer, where Homer managed a country singer named Lurleen Lumpkin, brought the show its most serious exploration of marital temptation. Lurleen was written as genuinely attractive to Homer in ways that went beyond the physical. She needed him. She appreciated him. She made him feel capable in a way that his daily life did not. The episode was scrupulous about Homer not acting on this attraction, while being equally scrupulous about depicting the attraction as real. He wanted her attention. He liked being the person she depended on. And he recognized this wanting and returned to Marge not because the wanting disappeared, but because the wanting was less than what he had at home. Season 4's Duffless, where Homer gave up beer for a month on a bet with Marge, is one of the show's most psychologically precise examinations of habit and dependency, and the specific landscape of a person's interior life when the thing they use to organize their leisure time is removed. Homer without beer is disoriented in ways that are comic but also real. The show understood that Homer's drinking was not simply a character trait but a structural element of his daily experience, a way he moved through time. Without it, time moved differently. New Kid on the Block, where Bart fell in love with the teenager next door, gave the show its first serious treatment of Bart's romantic life, and the specific, excruciating nature of adolescent love, all the more excruciating for Bart because he was 10 rather than adolescent. And the object of his love was several years older and had no romantic interest in him whatsoever. The episode treated his feelings as real and his pain at the rejection as real, without any of the condescension that adults writing children's emotions sometimes produces. Selma's Choice, where Selma Bouvier considered having a child and took Bart and Lisa to Duff Gardens as a trial run for parenthood, was one of the show's most generous treatments of a character usually. Deployed for comedy, Selma wanted something. She wanted the thing that Marge had, and she wanted it badly enough that the episode's examination of this wanting was never less than sympathetic. The Duff Gardens visit was hilarious, but the emotion at the episode's center was not. Brother from the Same Planet, where Bart sought a big brother because he felt Homer had been neglecting him, and Homer responded by seeking a little brother in competitive jealousy, worked on two levels simultaneously and maintained both without letting either undercut the other. The comedy of Homer's competitive parenting was fully realized. So, was the specific loneliness that drove Bart to seek a father figure outside his family? And the episode did not pretend that Homer's eventual reconnection with Bart fully resolved the underlying problem, only addressed its immediate expression. The season 5 episode Homer and Apu, where Apu lost his job at the Quickie Mart due to Homer's food poisoning complaint, and Homer helped him recover, it was the show's most extended treatment of Apu as a full character, and it revealed the degree to which the show had thought carefully about who Apu was when it was not simply using him as comic background. He had a life. He had a boss. He had a relationship to his work that was more complex than employment, something closer to identity. Losing the job was not just a financial crisis. It was a self-concept crisis, and the show treated it as such. Deep Space Homer, where Homer was selected by NASA to be a civilian astronaut, remains one of the show's most beloved pieces of pure escalating absurdity, but what grounds it emotionally is Homer's specific response to being chosen. He is moved. He is genuinely, deeply moved by being recognized as someone worth selecting, by being seen as someone whose contribution to an important endeavor was valuable. The absurdity of his selection: he was chosen because viewer ratings for space missions had declined, and NASA wanted to boost them with a more relatable figure, does not diminish Homer's feeling of being recognized. He does not know about the ratings. He only knows that someone picked him. The Season 6 premiere, Bart of Darkness, organized a Rear Window parody around Bart's broken leg and resulting confinement to his room, and produced in the process one of the season's most textured explorations of how Springfield's social world looked from the perspective of an observer rather than a participant. Bart, unable to participate in the summer's activities, becomes intensely focused on what he can see from his window, and what he sees, the ordinary domestic life of the neighborhood playing out in the summer heat, gradually takes on the quality of mystery simply through his sustained attention. The episode's comedy and its thriller elements were perfectly calibrated. Lisa's wedding, which flashed forward to show Lisa at 23, engaged to an Englishman, is the episode that proved the show understood who Lisa was going to become and that it cared about that future person. The adult Lisa was recognizable, brilliant, principled, still fighting her loneliness, still reaching for connection in a world that didn't entirely know what to do with her. The episode's emotional core was the scene between Lisa and Homer, in which Homer's unsophisticated love for his daughter came through with tremendous clarity, and Lisa understood something she needed to understand: that her father's love for her, for all its imperfections of expression, was completely real. These episodes are the architecture of the show's mythology. Each one introduced something: a character dynamic, a thematic concern, a narrative approach that the show built on and returned to. They are the load-bearing episodes, and exploring them with this kind of sustained attention makes visible the craft that underlies the comedy, the care that went into building a world substantial enough to sustain 36 years of stories. Section 12. The Voices, the Architecture of Sound in Springfield. The Simpsons is built from voices. This is true of all audiovisual storytelling, but it is especially true here because the primary cast of the show has voiced their characters for longer than many actors have been alive. And in that time, the voices have become so completely identified with the characters that they cannot be separated. Dan Castellaneta's Homer is Homer. Julie Kavner's Marge is Marge. Nancy Cartwright's Bart, Yeardley Smith's Lisa, Harry Shearer's Burns and Skinner, and Ned Flanders, these performances are the characters in the fullest sense. The original cast came together through a process that began in the mid-1980s, when Matt Groening was developing the animated shorts that would air as segments on The Tracy Ullman Show. The shorts needed voices, and Groening and producer James L. Brooks began the casting process that would eventually assemble the core ensemble. The voices that were chosen were not always the obvious choices. Yeardley Smith, for instance, was originally intended to voice Bart, and the decision to cast Nancy Cartwright as Bart and Smith as Lisa changed the dynamic of the family in ways that became fundamental to the show's identity. Cartwright's Bart had a roughness and a street-level authenticity that Smith's Lisa counterpointed with its specific quality of earnest longing. Dan Castellaneta developed Homer's voice through a process of experimentation. The early Homer was vocally different from the Homer that audiences know: rougher, less distinct, drawing more obviously on Walter Matthau as a reference point. The voice refined itself across the first season into the Homer that became iconic. The specific combination of plaintive longing and sudden enthusiasm, the particular way a syllable would extend unexpectedly, The D-O, not spelled out in the early scripts but described simply as annoyed grunt, which became one of the most recognizable sounds in American popular culture. Julie Kavner's Marge is built around a vocal quality that Kavner herself has described as emerging from a combination of her natural speaking voice and a specific kind of emotional restraint. Marge's voice has a faint rasp, a quality of being slightly held back, as though whatever is being said is passing through a filter of consideration before it reaches the air. This quality matches the character with extraordinary precision. Marge is always filtering, always considering, always deciding which of the things she could say is the one she should. The voice makes this visible in the ear. Nancy Cartwright came to the Bart audition intending to read for the part of Lisa, and left having taken the role of Bart, which she recognized as the more interesting challenge. Bart's voice is a studied performance of a specific kind of boyishness, not generic childhood energy, but the particular voice of a boy who is younger than he thinks he is and smarter than he lets on. Cartwright has described the process of finding Bart's voice as finding the character's confidence, the specific quality of a kid who has decided he is not going to be intimidated by the world, even if the world has not gotten the memo yet. Yeardley Smith's Lisa is perhaps the most emotionally transparent voice in the cast, the one that most directly communicates the character's interior state without seeming to mediate it. Lisa's voice does not have the comic exaggerations that characterize Homer's, or the deliberate performance quality of Bart's. It has a quality of sincerity that can shift registers from earnest idealism to sharp wit to genuine grief without losing its fundamental directness. When Lisa's voice breaks, in the moments when the show asked her to be truly sad, the break was always real, and it communicated to the audience that permission to feel was being offered. Harry Shearer's contributions to the show's vocal landscape are extraordinary in their breadth. He voices Burns, which alone would be a significant achievement. Burns's voice is a construction of enormous precision. The specific combination of age-related thinness and predatory sharpness, the way the consonants arrive with particular care, as though Burns is always choosing his words from a vocabulary that most of his interlocutors do not share. But Shearer also voices Ned Flanders, whose voice is the sonic opposite of Burns, warm, rounded, earnest, with the slight formality of a man who has decided that his speaking voice should reflect his values. And Skinner, and Lovejoy, and Dr. Hibbert, and Kent Brockman, and a dozen other recurring characters, each distinctly voiced, each immediately recognizable. Hank Azaria's contributions are equally remarkable in their variety. Apu, a character that has undergone significant reconsideration since the show's early seasons regarding its cultural representation, was voiced with a specificity that Azaria built from careful research into South Asian, English patterns. Moe's voice is a different kind of construction, rougher and more explicitly working class in its vocal texture, carrying the specific sound of a man who grew up learning that roughness was armor. Chief Wiggum is another distinct creation, a voice that sounds just benevolent and blurry enough to suggest the degree to which Wiggum's perception of the world he is supposed to be policing is fundamentally inadequate. The guest cast across the show's history represents an extraordinary accumulation of talent: actors, musicians, athletes, politicians, scientists, authors who came to Springfield and found in the experience something genuinely interesting. The show's animation style, the necessity of voicing a character without the physical performance that live action allows, required guest performers to work in ways that were unfamiliar and sometimes revelatory. Many of the most celebrated guest turns in the show's history were delivered by performers who spoke afterward about how different the work was from anything else they had done. Elizabeth Taylor's one-line appearance, Maggie's first word, Daddy, delivered by one of the most famous voices in the history of cinema, is one of the most memorable uses of a guest performer in the show's run, precisely because it asked so little and received so much. The word was simple. The voice that delivered it made it enormous. The choice to cast Taylor in that specific role was itself a statement about the kind of show. This was not the show that thought celebrity appearances were a marketing tool, but the show that thought carefully about what a specific voice, in a specific moment, could make happen. Michael Jackson's appearance in Stark Raving Dad, uncredited, remains one of the most discussed guest performances in the show's history. Jackson voiced a large white man in a mental institution who claimed to be Michael Jackson, which was a meta joke that required Jackson's participation to fully work. The specific quality of what Jackson brought to the role, a gentleness, a sense of someone finding their way toward genuine connection through an elaborate persona, resonated in ways that the episode's comedy alone could not have produced. The voice actors' longevity in their roles has created something that is unusual in American entertainment. Performances that have grown with the characters across a period of decades, accumulating history that is present in the voice even when the script does not reference it. When Dan Castellaneta voices Homer in a moment of genuine emotion in the scenes at Mona Simpson's deathbed, in the moments of real connection with his children, there is something in the voice that has been built from 36 years of being Homer, from thousands of episodes of exploring who this man is and what he feels. The history is in the sound. The music of the show deserves its own extended consideration. Alf Clausen composed the show's underscore for the first 27 seasons, creating an enormous library of original music that ranged from jazz to classical to country to orchestral film score. Clausen's scores were remarkable for their density of musical reference. He would quote or allude to other musical works within the show's score in ways that rewarded attentive listening without requiring it. The scores did the emotional work of communicating to the audience how to feel about a scene without being obvious about it, sitting underneath the comedy and lifting it, or underneath the emotion and deepening it. Danny Elfman's main title theme, the fanfare that opens every episode of the show, is one of the most recognizable pieces of music in American entertainment. It was written quickly, in a matter of days, and it managed to capture something essential about the show's energy, the brightness, the forward momentum, the quality of something about to happen that you cannot quite predict. The theme has been performed in orchestral settings around the world, covered by artists across every conceivable musical genre, and it has remained in continuous use since the show's first broadcast in 1989, which makes it one of the longest-running pieces of original television music in history. The couch gag, the brief animated sequence, different in almost every episode, in which the family runs to the couch in the living room for some version of comic surprise, gave the show's composers and animators a weekly laboratory for experimentation. Some couch gags were simple, some were elaborate, some were produced by guest artists who brought entirely different visual vocabularies to the Springfield visual world. The couch gags accumulated across 36 seasons into their own art form. A weekly microfilm whose constraint the family must get to the couch generated a remarkable variety of solutions. The chalkboard gag, Bart writing a punishment sentence on the blackboard at Springfield Elementary, opened the show's first act with a quick joke that was usually entirely disconnected from the episode's content. These gags were topical, occasionally controversial, sometimes genuinely funny, and they built across the seasons into a catalog of American cultural concerns, filtered through the sensibility of a 10-year-old who was writing punishment lines and finding ways to make each one its own small act of resistance. These are the materials from which Springfield was built, sound by sound and line by line. Voices that became characters, music that became emotional context, gags that became tradition, all of it assembled, over 36 years, into a world complete enough that 4 hours of exploration has not exhausted it, that you could spend another 4 hours and another after that and still find corners worth examining. Section 13. The show behind the show. The writers, the history, and the making of Springfield. Understanding The Simpsons as a made thing, as a piece of intentional craft produced by specific people in specific circumstances, is part of understanding why it became what it became. The show did not simply emerge. It was built, episode by episode, by a writing staff that included some of the most talented comedy writers in the history of American television, and the story of how that staff worked, what they argued about, what they got right and what they got wrong, is the story behind the story of Springfield. Matt Groening created the Simpsons characters as a response to a production situation. He had been asked to pitch animated shorts for the Tracy Ullman Show, had not been able to secure the rights to his existing comic strip characters, and over the course of a lobby waiting period invented the Simpson family essentially from scratch. The speed of the invention is remarkable. Homer, Marge, Bart, Lisa, Maggie, all of them, created in the time it takes to keep a producer waiting. They were named after Groening's own family members, with the exception of Bart. His own name rhymes with fart, which he considered sufficient reason to change it. James L. Brooks, the producer who brought The Simpsons shorts to television and then shepherded the full series into existence, brought to the project a specific vision of what television comedy could be. Brooks had been a writer on The Mary Tyler Moore Show, had produced Taxi and The Tracy Ullman Show, and was at that point one of the most commercially successful and critically respected figures in American comedy television. His conviction that animated television could carry the same emotional weight as live-action drama, that there was no category reason why a cartoon had to be lighter or less serious than a show with human actors, shaped the project from its beginning. Sam Simon, the third member of the original producing triumvirate, was perhaps the most significant influence on the show's early writing. He developed the visual style, hired and organized the first writing staff, and established the working processes that define the show's production approach. Simon left the show after the fourth season, under circumstances that included significant creative and interpersonal conflict, and the relationship between his contribution and the show's legacy has been a source of ongoing discussion among fans and critics. His influence on the first 4 seasons, the seasons most consistently cited as the peak of the show's achievement, was formative. The writing staff that Simon assembled for the early seasons was extraordinary by any measure. Many of the people in that room had academic backgrounds, mathematics, physics, history, law that were unusual for a comedy writing staff and gave the show's jokes a density of reference that rewarded the attentive viewer. John Swartzwelder, the most prolific writer in the show's history with more than 50 credited episodes, was a genuine eccentric whose scripts combined surrealist logic with precise structural comedy in ways that defined the show's comedy approach for an entire era. George Meyer, Jeff Martin, John Vitti, Jay Kogan, and Wallace Wolodarski, Al Jean, and Mike Reiss, these were the writers who turned the show from a promising premise into something genuinely great. The writer's room, as described by people who worked in it, was a space of unusual intellectual intensity. The show's culture valued the ability to take a good joke and make it better, to find the unexpected angle on a premise, to hold a script to standards of surprise and precision that the network's notes rarely shared. The process of writing an episode from initial outline, to table read, to revision, to final production could take months, with the script passing through multiple complete reconceptions before settling into its final form. The episode you watched at the end of that process had been argued over, restructured, picked apart, and rebuilt many times, and what survived the process was, in the best cases, something that had the quality of inevitability, the sense that it could not have been any other way. The show's relationship with the network that broadcast it, Fox, was consistently productive and occasionally contentious, in the way of creative relationships where one party has financial control and the other has creative vision. Fox's notes on early episodes were sometimes accommodated and sometimes ignored. The show's producers had enough leverage, from early on, to maintain creative decisions they believed in, and the show's willingness to deal with subject matter that other animated shows avoided was protected by the same commercial success that made it worth fighting for. The international dimension of the show's production is rarely discussed but worth noting. The Simpsons has been animated, for most of its run, by studios in South Korea, with the American production providing storyboards, timing, and direction that the Korean animators executed. This division of labor was common in American animation of the era and after, and it produced the particular visual consistency of the show across its run-the-house style that made Springfield look like itself regardless of which specific artists were producing the frames. The relationship between the American creative staff and the Korean animators, working across time zones and languages, was part of the logistical complexity that produced what appeared on screen as seamless storytelling. The show's political consciousness was always present and was occasionally explicit. The satire of Burns as a figure of unchecked corporate power, of the nuclear industry's relationship to public safety, of democratic processes that were captured by concentrated wealth, these were not accidental. The writers had views, and the show was a vehicle for those views, filtered through comedy but not obscured by it. The satire of the media, particularly the television media, was consistent and pointed across the entire run. Kent Brockman, the show's television news anchor, was a portrait of local news priorities, the preference for drama over substance, the anchor's own celebrity as a story in itself, the relationship between the news product and the commercial interests it served that became more accurate rather than less as the decades passed. The show's longest-running creative tension was around the question of continuity. From the beginning, the show had resisted the kind of continuity that required viewers to have watched every previous episode in order to understand any given one. It wanted each episode to be complete in itself, accessible to anyone who tuned in for the first time on any given Sunday. This commitment to episodic accessibility meant that developments between episodes' growth, change, consequence were regularly erased in ways that frustrated fans who had invested in the characters' stories. The debate over the Armin Tamzarian episode was the most public expression of this tension, but it was not the only one. Each time the show made a significant change to a character or relationship and then walked it back, it was acting on this fundamental commitment to accessibility over continuity. Each time fans objected to the walking back, they were expressing the countervailing commitment that grows from extended engagement with a narrative, the investment in the idea that what happens should matter, that the characters should carry their history. The show's writers, over the decades, developed various positions on this tension and various accommodations to it. Some developments stuck Lisa's vegetarianism, Sideshow Bob's status as a recurring villain, the basic family dynamics established in the early seasons. Others were treated as if they had never happened, without acknowledgement. The floating timeline, which is the most fundamental expression of the show's commitment to accessibility over continuity, was simply maintained as a structural fact, never explained, never apologized for. The transition between the show's major creative eras from the early classic period to the middle years to the current run has been discussed by the people who made the show in ways that reveal the difficulty of maintaining quality across a production that never stopped. The original writing staff, assembled by Sam Simon and augmented by the talents that the show's early success attracted, dispersed over time as individuals moved to other projects, started their own shows, or simply aged out of the particular kind of grueling intensity that television comedy production requires at its highest level. Each departure changed the room. Each new hire brought something different. The show evolved, not always in ways that its original audience appreciated. The later seasons, from season 12 or so onward, though the specific moment of decline is debated endlessly, were produced by a different kind of writing staff working under different constraints. The original writers had the luxury of inventing the show as they wrote it, of discovering what worked through the process of making it. The later writers had to work within a fully established mythology, had to produce stories that felt fresh within a framework that had been explored for a decade, had to make Homer funny in ways that had not been exhausted across 200 previous episodes of Homer being funny. That this is difficult is obvious. That the show maintained any consistent quality across the whole of its run is, on reflection, quite remarkable. Not every episode of later seasons is great, but the later seasons contain episodes that are genuinely excellent, that do things with the characters and the world that earlier seasons had not thought to try, that find new angles on the show's fundamental questions and explore them with real intelligence. The show's future, and as of this recording, it has not ended, it is continuing, it is producing new episodes, is genuinely unknown territory. Season 36 and beyond occupy a space in the show's history that will only be accessible from a distance, when there is enough time to see which of the current episodes will prove to have mattered and which will be footnotes. The history of the show suggests that the answer will be surprising, that the episodes that seem most significant in the moment of production are not always the ones that last, and that the ones that last are often the ones that touch something in the audience's relationship to the characters that no one fully anticipated. What is not unknown is what the show has already accomplished. 36 years, nearly 800 episodes, a cast and crew who gave a significant portion of their professional lives to a fictional town in an unspecified American state. An audience that came to that town with them, generation after generation, finding in it something that kept bringing them back. That is a substantial thing. It is, by any measure, a substantial thing. Section 14. The Philosophy of Springfield. What the show actually believed. After 36 years of comedy and satire and sentiment and storytelling, what does The Simpsons actually believe? What is the philosophical position underneath the jokes? What does Springfield, taken as a serious fictional document, tell us about the world it was made in and the world it helped to shape? The question is not frivolous. A show that ran for this long, that reached this many people, that embedded itself this deeply in the cultural consciousness of its era, developed a philosophy whether it intended to or not. The ideas it repeated, the values it returned to, the conflicts it chose to stage and the ways it resolved them, these accumulated into something that functioned as a worldview. The show's most consistent philosophical position is about the relationship between aspiration and reality, between who people want to be and who they actually manage to be. Springfield is full of people who aspire to things they cannot achieve. Homer aspires to respect. Marge aspires to a family life equal to the idealized version she carries in her imagination. Bart aspires to freedom from consequence. Lisa aspires to a world that honors truth and justice. Burns aspires to permanence in a universe that does not grant it. None of them achieve what they aspire to. This is not a tragedy in the show's telling. It is simply the condition of being alive, of having desires in a world whose capacity to fulfill them is always partial. What the show consistently valued was not the achievement of aspiration, but the continuing relationship to it, the fact of wanting, the fact of trying, the fact of showing up for another day despite the imperfect results of the previous ones. This is a form of pragmatic optimism that distinguishes the show from both pure cynicism and uncritical feel-good storytelling. It does not pretend things are better than they are. Burns is genuinely dangerous. The plant genuinely poisons people. The democratic process in Springfield genuinely fails its citizens most of the time. These things are depicted clearly and honestly, but they are depicted in the context of a family that loves each other and keeps trying, which insists that the presence of systemic failure does not preclude the possibility of individual love, that the corruption of institutions does not preclude the integrity of human relationships. The show's treatment of class is one of its most consistent and least discussed philosophical commitments. Springfield is a working-class town, and the show depicted working-class life with a specificity and a lack of condescension that was unusual in American television of its era. Homer's economic anxieties are real and recurring. The mortgage, the medical bills, the car repairs, the grocery costs, the impossible arithmetic of a single income supporting a family of 5 in an economy that was actively working against families like his. These anxieties were not background noise. They were the organizing condition of Homer's daily life, the thing that sent him back to the plant every morning when every morning he would have preferred not to go. The show's consistent sympathy for the working class was matched by its consistent critique of the wealthy. Burns is the show's most elaborately developed portrait of wealth, and the portrait is not flattering. But Burns is not just a caricature. He is a systems product, someone whose wealth gave him access to the mechanisms that sustained and extended his wealth indefinitely, who used those mechanisms with a ruthlessness that was itself the product of an education and an environment that rewarded ruthlessness. He is not evil because of some personal moral deficiency. He is what his circumstances made him, and his circumstances are the show's indictment of a system that can produce someone like him. The show's treatment of government and civic institutions is more complicated and more interesting than a simple satire of incompetence. Mayor Quimby is corrupt and incompetent, yes. Chief Wiggum is benevolently useless. Superintendent Chalmers performs accountability without producing it. But the show also, in its better moments, depicted the possibility of civic life, the town meetings where real debates happened, the moments where community action produced real results, the episodes where Springfield's residents organized around a shared interest and achieved something. The critique of civic institutions was never a critique of civic engagement, only of civic institutions that had been captured by interests other than the communities. The show's religious philosophy is its most surprising philosophical dimension. Springfield is a religious community. The First Church of Springfield is a recurring location. The Reverend Lovejoy is a recurring character. Faith is a constant presence in the civic life of the town. And the show's treatment of this faith is neither dismissive nor credulous. God exists in Springfield's universe, as established by direct dramatic evidence. But God's existence does not mean that the institutions of faith are immune from the show's comic analysis. Lovejoy's sermons are vapid. The church's social function is often more about social sorting than spiritual development. Religious belief in Springfield, as elsewhere, can be sincere or performed or both simultaneously. Ned Flanders's faith is the show's most extended examination of sincere religious belief, and the show's treatment of it is more complex than it is usually credited with being. Ned's faith is genuine. The show does not mock it as superstition or dismiss it as naivete. It takes the faith seriously enough to put it under pressure to show what a sincere faith looks like when the universe it believes in produces results that the believer cannot explain within the framework of that belief. God talks to Homer and ignores Ned. This is not presented as evidence that God does not exist. It is presented as evidence that the relationship between faith and divine attention is more mysterious and less reliable than simple belief would suggest. The show's philosophy of family is perhaps its deepest and most consistent commitment. The family is the unit that matters. Not the abstract family of political rhetoric, but the specific, imperfect, daily practice of 5 particular people, choosing each other over and over in the context of a world that makes this choice continuously difficult. The show respected family life in its full complexity, the love and the frustration, and the moments of genuine connection, and the longer stretches of taking each other for granted, and the crises that forced renewed choice, and the quiet evenings when nothing happened and everyone was just present. Together, what the family meant, in the show's telling, was not an ideal to be achieved but a practice to be maintained. It was not the family of aspirational television, not the functional, communicative, emotionally sophisticated family that advice books recommend. It was a family that operated at its best capacity, which was often not very high, and that continued anyway. The continuance was what mattered. The daily choice to show up, the daily return to the couch, the daily fact of being together rather than apart. The show's philosophy of comedy is worth articulating, because it was not casual. The Simpsons believed that comedy was serious work, that finding the funny angle on a situation was not a lesser achievement than finding the dramatic angle, that laughter was as valid and as valuable an emotional response as the responses that more prestige-coded art reached for. The show was funny first and everything else after, not because funny was easy, but because funny was hard and worth doing well. And finally, the show's philosophy of time. Time passes in the world. The characters do not age. This is a choice with philosophical content, not merely a production convenience. The show has been, across its entire run, in an argument with time resisting the passage of it, insisting on the preservation of this specific moment, keeping the family at these specific ages, maintaining Springfield at this specific level of technological development. This is not pure nostalgia, it is something more specific. The show pressed pause on a version of the American middle-class family and said, "This deserves to be preserved. Not idealized, not sanitized, but preserved in its full specificity, the economic anxiety and the working-class dignity and the domestic love and the civic failure and the human resilience and the particular comedy of people doing their best with what they have. This family deserves permanence. This moment deserves to last. Whether that permanence is achieved through radiation or coma or collective denial or the simple fact of good television that people keep choosing to watch, the result is the same. Springfield persists. The family sits on the couch. Homer comes home. The lights are on at 742 Evergreen Terrace, and will be, for as long as people keep turning them on. That is what the show believed. That the light at the end of the driveway was worth preserving. That the family inside deserved to last. That the America Springfield represented messy and anxious and imperfect and real was worth examining carefully and keeping, even in all its imperfection, even for another 36 years. And so, here we are. The 4 hours are nearly gone. Springfield is quiet. The plant is humming at its low and steady frequency in the dark at the edge of town. The Quickie Mart lights are on. Moe has turned the bar sign off. The Simpsons are on the couch. Homer is almost asleep. Marge is sitting with her thoughts. Bart has his feet up somewhere they are not supposed to be. Lisa has her eyes closed, listening to something inside her own head. Maggie is perfectly still. The night presses gently against the windows of 742 Evergreen Terrace. And in the warm, particular darkness of the family room, in the blue light of the television, in the easy breathing of people who have made it through another day together, Springfield holds. The show will be here when you wake up. End. Section 15. Episode by episode through the seasons. A slow tour through the complete history of The Simpsons. We have spent the earlier sections of this journey talking about characters, themes, philosophy, and pivotal moments. Now, as the night deepens and sleep begins to settle in properly, we are going to slow down even further. We are going to drift through the show's history season by season, episode by episode in the quietest possible way, not racing to reach any particular destination, but simply moving through the full catalog of Springfield stories the way you might drift through a familiar neighborhood on a very late walk, acknowledging each house, each corner, each tree you know by memory. This is the longest stretch of the journey, It is meant to be. Let it carry you. The first season began in December of 1989 and concluded in May of 1990, running 13 episodes in all. Each episode was in some sense a discovery, the show learning what it was through the process of making it, the writers and animators and voice cast finding their footing in a world that had not yet been fully mapped. The early episodes have a distinct texture, slightly rougher in their animation, slightly less certain in their comedic rhythm, slightly more earnest in their emotional ambitions that becomes endearing in retrospect. The way early photographs of people you love have a quality of vulnerability that later ones do not. The second episode ever broadcast, Bart the Genius, established the show's willingness to take an episodic premise to its logical extreme. If Bart were suddenly considered a genius, what would that look like specifically? Not in the vague generalities of a wish fulfillment story, but in the particular daily texture of navigating a social environment built around an assumption that was false. The episode worked not because the premise was clever, but because the execution was committed. The writers actually thought through what it would mean, day by day, for Bart to be in that school, to be around those students, to encounter those teachers, and they found the comedy in the specificity rather than the generality. Homer's Odyssey. The third episode gave Homer his first existential crisis, which the show staged with characteristic economy. He lost his job, contemplated suicide on a bridge, was talked back from the edge by his family's appearance, and transformed his near tragedy into a civic mission to improve Springfield's safety infrastructure, which eventually led Burns to rehire him as a safety inspector. In 13 minutes of television, the show managed to touch suicidal ideation, the fragility of working-class economic security, the power of family connection as a counterforce to despair, and the comic absurdity of a man who nearly died becoming the most zealous advocate for public safety in a town that had previously done without such advocacy. The compression was itself a kind of skill. There's no disgrace like home. The fourth episode reversed the family dynamic in a way that would become a recurring formal experiment throughout the show's run. Rather than the family being the norm against which the outside world was measured, this episode made the family the problem and the outside world the standard. Homer, humiliated by his family's behavior at a company picnic, became obsessed with turning them into a more presentable version of themselves, and the episode's comedy came from the gap between his aspirations and their actual capacities. The episode also introduced in its premise the show's fundamental interest in class performance, in the way that working-class people are expected to behave in middle-class social settings, and the inevitable failure of the attempt. Bart the General has been discussed, but the episode that followed it, Moaning Lisa, deserves the extended treatment it received in Lisa's section, because it was the first episode of the show to be organized entirely around an emotional, rather than a comedic premise. The show was 5 episodes old when it decided to do an episode primarily about childhood depression. This was either extremely confident or extremely fortunate, and it was, as it happened, both. The episode worked because the writers had a genuine understanding of Lisa, had known since they created her that her particular combination of intelligence and sensitivity would create a specific kind of suffering, and they were willing to depict that suffering seriously from the very beginning. The Call of the Simpsons, the 7th episode, put Homer in the wilderness on a camping trip gone wrong, and found in the experience a comedy of physical humiliation and species confusion. Mistaken for a mythological Bigfoot creature by the media and scientific community of Springfield, Homer was poked and prodded and analyzed and ultimately revealed to be nothing more than a very large, very hairy man who had been living in the woods for a few days. The episode's comedy was physical and immediate in a way that made it a useful counterpoint to the more emotionally complex material around it. The Telltale Head, the 8th episode, has been discussed, and Life on the Fast Lane. The 9th introduced for the first time the possibility that Marge's marriage might be vulnerable, that she was capable of being drawn to someone outside it, that Homer's complacency had costs. The episode handled this possibility with a lightness and a resolution that suggested the writers were still calibrating how dark they were willing to go, but the question it posed whether the Simpsons' marriage was strong enough to survive Marge's discovery of her own unfulfilled desires would return in more serious forms in later seasons. Homer's Night Out. The 10th episode introduced the exotic dancer and the circulated photograph, and the show's first examination of what dignity meant in a context where privacy had been violated. The Crepes of Wrath. The 11th sent Bart to France as an exchange student in circumstances that were closer to indentured labor than cultural education, and the episode's examination of what happens when a child is removed from the protections of his family and placed in the hands of strangers who mean him harm, was played for comedy but organized around a genuine concern. Krusty Gets Busted, the 12th episode, introduced Sideshow Bob for the first time, in his original function as the villain of a frame-up story. Bob had framed Krusty for a convenience store robbery, had become the star of Krusty's show in his absence, and was exposed by Bart and Lisa's investigation. The episode established Bob's intelligence, his resentment, and his theatrical self-presentation in their original forms. It also established Krusty as a figure of fallen celebrity, someone whose professional identity had been constructed so completely around the performance of cheerfulness that its removal revealed a person who had no idea who he was. When the clown makeup came off, Some Enchanted Evening, the 13th episode and the season finale, put Homer and Marge's marriage through a crisis organized around the discovery that their relationship had drifted into something comfortable to the point of neglect, and resolved it with a romantic gesture that was distinctly Homerian in its combination of good intention and poor execution. The babysitter subplot, the babysitter bandit, as she was called, who was eventually exposed and subdued by Bart, Lisa, and Maggie working together, established early the show's capacity for parallel storytelling across multiple domestic spaces. Season 2 opened in the fall of 1990 with Bart Gets an F, discussed at length, and moved immediately into Simpson and Delilah, in which Homer's use of hair growth formula gave him a full head of hair and, as a result, the professional advancement that his bald head had apparently been preventing. The episode's examination of the relationship between appearance and opportunity, of the way professional evaluation was filtered through aesthetic biases that had nothing to do with competence, was as pointed as it was funny, and its reversal ending, in which Homer lost the hair and the position, was honest about the way those biases operated without resolution. Treehouse of Horror, the first Halloween special, established the anthology format that would run for 36 consecutive years. 3 stories: The Haunted House, The Raven, based on Poe's poem, with Homer as the narrator being tormented by a Bart-shaped raven, and The Alien Abduction by Kang and Kodos. The special was produced with the understanding that it existed outside the canonical universe, which gave it a freedom that the regular episodes could not always exercise, and the writers used that freedom to explore tonal registers, genuine horror, literary parody, science fiction that the main show held at arm's length. 2 cars in every garage and 3 eyes on every fish introduced Blinky and Burns's political ambitions in the same episode, which was a formally unusual choice, combining the show's environmental satire with its political satire and letting them interrogate each other. Burns running for governor as the show's response to the three-eyed fish scandal, attempting to manage the optics of having created a mutant, was the series' first explicit statement about the relationship between political power and environmental accountability. Dancin' Homer, the 5th episode of Season 2, sent Homer to AAA baseball as a mascot, a story that worked because it was fundamentally about the experience of brief recognition followed by the return to ordinary life, of being seen and celebrated, and then returning to the condition of being a person in a crowd. Homer's mascot career was a particular kind of success story, success that was entirely dependent on his capacity for enthusiasm rather than his skills. That could not be translated into the professional context of Major League Baseball. That ended when the context changed. The episode was sympathetic about this in ways that treated Homer's experience as real, rather than as a setup for comedy. Dead Putting Society, the 6th episode of Season 2, organized a family competition around miniature golf in a way that exposed the specific dynamics of the Flanders-Simpson relationship early in the Beth show's run. The episode was the first to take Ned seriously as an adversary rather than simply as a neighbor, to engage with the specific challenge of someone who was genuinely better at everything Homer tried to do and who was genuinely kind about it, which made the challenge more infuriating than overt antagonism would have been. Bart vs. Thanksgiving has been discussed. Bart the Daredevil, the 8th episode of Season 2, gave the show its first major physical comedy set piece. Homer's slide down Springfield Gorge, falling over the edge, bouncing down the rocky cliff face, being airlifted to the hospital, falling off the helicopter, bouncing down the cliff again. The sequence was an early signal of the show's interest in the physical possibilities of animation, in the specific comedy of cartoon physics, applied to a character who was not quite invincible, but was consistently more durable than he had any right to be. Itchy and Scratchy and Marge. The ninth episode of Season 2 was the show's first direct engagement with the question of media violence. The debate that television censors and parent advocates had been having for decades about the relationship between violent content on television and violent behavior in children. The episode positioned itself on the issue with characteristic intelligence, having Marge lead a crusade against the show within the show's violence, while simultaneously being forced to defend artistic freedom when the same advocacy group came after Michelangelo's David. The symmetry was the show's argument, that the protection of offensive content is inseparable from the protection of art, that you cannot draw lines around violence in cartoon cats, without also having to draw lines around nudity in Renaissance sculptures, and that the drawing of such lines is a more complicated business than the Crusaders for it typically acknowledged. Bart gets hit by a car. The 10th episode of Season 2 built a legal comedy around Homer's attempt to fraudulently maximize an insurance settlement following Bart's accident, and made Lionel Hutz, the show's disreputable lawyer, a fully realized character in his first substantial appearance. Hutz's combination of professional incompetence and absolute conviction in his own competence was a recurring joke that the show used across many subsequent appearances to explore the relationship between legal credentials and actual legal skill. One fish, two fish, blowfish, bluefish. The 11th episode gave Homer a terminal diagnosis, incorrectly, as it turned out. But he did not know that during the episode and spent the episode with him going through a list of things he wanted to do before he died. The episode was a meditation on what matters when the usual assumption that there will be time later for the important things is removed, and it arrived at answers that were both funny and genuine. What Homer wanted was not grand. He wanted to spend time with his father, to play with his children, to make love to his wife, to say things he had been leaving unsaid. The episode's final image, Homer, who has lived through the night he thought would be his last, sitting on the couch at sunrise watching television, was the show's first genuinely great closing image, and it established the couch as a place of rest rather than merely a destination for the opening credits gag. The Way We Was, the 12th episode of Season 2, told Homer and Marge's courtship story for the first time, establishing the high school setting and the specific circumstances of their first connection. Homer joined the debate team specifically to spend time with Marge. Marge's initial rejection of Homer's romantic advances was honest and credible within the story's terms. The eventual resolution, Marge's choice of Homer over her planned date, was built carefully enough to feel chosen rather than inevitable. This episode created the emotional backstory that all subsequent Homer and Marge episodes depended on, and the show returned to and revised and extended it multiple times across the following decades. Homer vs. Lisa and the Eighth Commandment, the 13th episode, gave the Simpson family an illegal cable box and built an episode out of the ethical implications of using it, with Lisa's conscience and Homer's enjoyment in direct conflict. The episode was the show's first direct engagement with Lisa's moral reasoning, and it established the pattern that would recur throughout her storylines. Lisa's ethics were real, her reasoning was sound, and her family was not equipped to fully honor them, and the comedy was in the gap while the sympathy was with Lisa. Principal Charming, the 14th episode of Season 2, sent Skinner into a romantic situation with Selma Bouvier that revealed both characters more completely than their earlier appearances had allowed. Skinner's romantic inexperience, his mother's interference, his genuine interest in Selma, and his inability to act on it, these were developed with a care that the episode's premise did not obviously require. Oh brother, where art thou? The 15th episode of Season 2 introduced Herb Powell, Homer's half-brother, who had been given up for adoption at birth and grown up to become a self-made millionaire car manufacturer. The episode's emotional content, the reunion of two half-brothers across the vast economic gulf that separated their lives, was the show's most ambitious experiment with genuine sentiment at that point in its run, and it largely succeeded because the writers understood that the sentiment had to be earned through the comedy rather than substituted for it. Herb's decision to let Homer design a car for him, and the catastrophic result, was both the episode's funniest sequence and its most honest observation about the gap between creative freedom and practical competence. Season 3 began in the fall of 1991 with Stark Raving Dad, and continued through what would become the show's first full cycle of sophisticated storytelling, the season in which the show's ambitions and its execution began consistently to match each other. Mr. Lisa Goes to Washington, The second episode of Season 3 sent Lisa to a national essay competition in Washington, D.C., where she discovered that the political process she admired was more thoroughly corrupt than she had understood. The episode was sharp in its satire of American political culture, without being cynical about the possibility of individual integrity within that culture, and it resolved with the specific mechanism by which Lisa's exposure of a bribe led to legislative action, suggesting that the system could still sometimes respond to truth even in its compromised state. When Flanders failed, the third episode of Season 3 was the show's first serious exploration of Ned Flanders' interior life, organized around the failure of his left-handed store, the Leftorium, and Homer's shameful pleasure in watching him fail. The episode's comedy came from Homer's small, human satisfaction in Ned's difficulties, but its emotional content came from the recognition that this small pleasure was a form of cruelty, and that Ned, who had done nothing to deserve it, deserved something more from his neighbor. Homer's eventual decision to help Ned, though motivated initially by guilt, was depicted as a genuine choice with genuine consequences. Bart the murderer and Homer defined have been discussed. Like father, like clown, the sixth episode of Season 3 is one of the earliest examples of the show using Krusty seriously, as a character rather than as a comedy function. His estrangement from his father had real feeling in it, and the reconciliation scene with Jackie Mason delivering the rabbi's lines was the show's most emotionally straightforward moment in what had been, up to that point, a season with more complicated emotional terrain. Treehouse of Horror 2 gave the show its second anthology Halloween special and included Lisa's Nightmare, in which Homer acquired a monkey's paw with predictable wish gone wrong. Consequences Bart's Nightmare, in which Bart's thought-reading powers gave the town's residents no privacy, and Homer's Nightmare, in which Burns transplanted Homer's brain into a robotic body. Each of the three segments used its central conceit to examine one of the show's core relationships. The first looked at the family's collective desire for prosperity and its costs, the second, at the burden of knowing too much about the people around you, and the third, at the specific horror of losing bodily autonomy to someone with power over you. Lisa's Pony, the eighth episode of Season 3, was one of the first episodes to examine the specific kind of guilt that parents feel when they fail to deliver on something their child needed. And Homer's response to having disappointed Lisa at the school talent show buying her a pony she had always wanted was characteristic in its emotional generosity and its practical unsustainability. The pony required Homer to take a second job at the Quick E-Mart to pay for its upkeep, working overnight shifts that left him falling asleep at the plant. The episode held both the love and its costs in view simultaneously, which was the kind of moral complexity that the show was developing a real facility with. Saturdays of Thunder, the ninth episode of Season 3, put Homer against the realization that he did not know basic facts about his son Bart's favorite color, his teacher's name, his best friend's name, and responded to this realization by committing himself to the project of understanding Bart better in the context of a soapbox derby race. The National Fatherhood Institute's test, which Homer failed comprehensively, was the episode's comic motor, but its emotional content was the genuine effort Homer made once he understood the extent of his previous inattention. Flaming Moe's, the 10th episode of Season 3, has been discussed in terms of its treatment of intellectual property and the Homer-Moe friendship. Burns verkaufen der Kraftwerk, the 11th, sold the plant to a pair of German investors and gave Homer his first experience of working under management that was competent and rational, which was nearly as disorienting as working under Burns. The Germans' assessments of the plant's operations were entirely accurate and entirely alarming, and their decision to sell the plant back to Burns after calculating the cost of compliance was a brutal endorsement of Burns's approach. I Married Marge, the 12th episode of Season 3, returned to Homer and Marge's courtship story for the second time, this time extending it into the period of Marge's pregnancy with Bart and Homer's attempts to find stable employment to support the growing family. The episode added texture to the backstory established in The Way We Was and gave both Homer and Marge more complex motivations for the choices they made in the period before the show began. Radio Bart, the 13th episode, was the show's most explicit engagement with media manipulation and the particular cruelty of celebrity attention cycles. Bart's prank, faking a trapped child scenario using a radio transmitter, drew the entire town's attention and eventually his own exposure, but the episode's sharpest observation was about how quickly the media's attention moved on, How briefly the moment of crisis commanded focus before it was replaced by the next event? Lisa the Greek. The 14th episode of Season 3 discovered that Lisa had an uncanny talent for predicting football game outcomes through analytical reasoning, which Homer attempted to exploit for gambling purposes, and organized the episode around Lisa's gradual discovery that the attention her father was paying her was conditional on her continuing to pick winners. The episode's emotional climax, Lisa's prediction in the Super Bowl, as a test of whether Homer valued her or only her usefulness, was one of the show's most honest examinations of the specific loneliness of a child who wants to be loved without conditions. Homer Alone, the 15th episode of Season 3, gave Marge her first breakdown, a moment of complete overwhelm at the intersection of too many demands on her attention and patience and time. She drove to a bridge, stopped her car in the middle of it, and refused to move. The episode's willingness to depict Marge's exhaustion seriously, without playing it as comedy or resolving it quickly, was the show honoring something real about what Marge's daily life cost her. Her recovery at Rancho Relaxo, a spa episode that was mostly played for pleasure, was the show also honoring the reality that sometimes people need rest, simply rest, without narrative resolution attached to it. Bart the Lover, the 16th episode of Season 3, set up a parallel storyline between Bart's anonymous romantic correspondence with a teacher he had developed a crush on and Homer's struggle to stop swearing. The two stories were connected thematically by the question of language, of whether you could express who you were through words you did not naturally use, of whether the performance of a different self in language could eventually produce a different self in practice. Bart wrote beautiful letters to Mrs. Krabappel using the whole family's suggestions. Homer replaced every swear word with dagnabbit. Neither transformation fully persisted, but both attempts were real. Homer at the bat has been discussed, and separate vocations. The 18th episode of Season 3 was one of the more formally adventurous episodes in the season, swapping Bart and Lisa's social roles based on vocational aptitude test results. Lisa's aptitude test suggested she was suited for homemaking. Bart suggested he had the qualities needed for law enforcement. The episode explored both results seriously, following Lisa into a spell of deliberate underachievement and Bart into a stint as a hall monitor with genuine enthusiasm for order, before returning both to their original orientations, with the understanding that those orientations were not merely socially imposed, but genuinely expressive of who they were. Dog of Death, the 19th episode of Season 3 has been discussed. Colonel Homer, the 20th has been discussed. Black Widower, the 21st brought Sideshow Bob back in a story organized around his romance with Selma Bouvier, and was the first episode to develop what would become the characteristic Sideshow Bob format. Bob's plan, the plan's near success, Bart's recognition of the pattern before it resolved in disaster, the confrontation. The series of Sideshow Bob episodes that the show produced across the next several seasons were among the most formally satisfying storytelling exercises in the show's history, variations on a structure whose pleasures came from the quality of the execution rather than the novelty of the premise. The Auto Show, the 22nd episode of Season 3, gave the school bus driver his most complete character portrait, built around Otto's response to discovering that he could not pass the driver's license test and therefore could not legally drive the bus. Otto's relationship to responsibility, his genuine lack of it, his eventual provisional acceptance of it, was handled with more sympathy than his function as a comedy peripheral usually received. Bart's Friend Falls in Love, the 23rd episode of Season 3, introduced Samantha Stanky, Milhouse's first girlfriend, and examined the specific social dynamics of a third party entering an established male friendship. Bart's jealousy, which he would not have named as jealousy, was real, and the episode treated it as real, finding in it the particular comedy of a child who did not have the vocabulary for the emotion he was experiencing, and therefore could not manage it effectively. Brother, Can You Spare 2 Dimes? The 24th episode of Season 3 and the season finale brought Herb Powell back, this time in reduced circumstances, following the commercial failure of the Homer-designed car, and built the season's final emotional moment around Herb's attempt to design a baby communication device using the investment money Homer provided. The episode's resolution, Herb's success, his forgiveness of Homer, his restored wealth was more tidily satisfying than many Simpsons resolutions. But the warmth between the two half-brothers had enough foundation by this point to make the satisfaction feel earned. Season 4 discussed at length in the Golden Era section, produced in its 22 episodes, perhaps the single most consistent run of quality in the show's history. Each episode in the season deserves a moment. Camp Krusty, which opened the season, was the show's response to the first season cliffhanger about whether Bart would pass 4th grade. He did, barely, by promising to be good, and sent Bart and Lisa to Krusty's summer camp, which turned out to be a prison camp run by counselors who had abandoned the premises to a group of older, menacing campers. The season premiere established that the show was willing to put its children in genuinely uncomfortable situations, that the fantasy of summer camp could contain real darkness, and that Bart was capable of organizational leadership when the cause was righteous. A streetcar named Marge has been discussed at length. Homer the heretic and its theological ambitions have been examined. Lisa the beauty queen and its portrait of paternal love have been noted. The subsequent episodes of Season 4, Treehouse of Horror 3, Itchy and Scratchy, the movie, Marge Gets a Job, New Kid on the Block, Mr. Plow, Lisa's First Word, Homer's Triple Bypass, Marge versus The Monorail, Selma's Choice, Brother from the Same Planet, I Love Lisa, Duffless, Last Exit to Springfield, So It's Come To. This, a Simpsons clip show, The Front, Whacking Day, Marge in Chains, Krusty Gets Cancelled, each one a distinct achievement, each one building the world of Springfield from a slightly different angle, each one contributing to the accumulation of specificity and history and feeling that made the show what it became. Lisa's First Word, which told the story of how the family got their house and how Bart responded to Lisa's arrival, was the show's most carefully constructed backstory episode of the season, giving both children their foundational memories and establishing the emotional geography of 742 Evergreen Terrace in the period before the show began. The episode's final scene, Maggie, alone in her crib after Homer has sat with her and she has not spoken, turning to the camera and speaking her first word in a voice that the show chose to use Elizabeth Taylor for, was one of the show's most purely magical moments. Last Exit to Springfield has been discussed at length as possibly the show's greatest individual episode. What has not been said is that its greatness is partly a greatness of compression. The episode contains, in 30 minutes, a complete account of the relationship between capital and labor, of the psychology of union organizing, of the dynamics of negotiation across a power imbalance, of Homer's particular combination of ignorance and accidental effectiveness, of Burns's particular combination of intelligence and moral bankruptcy. It is a small, perfect political comedy that manages to be genuinely funny about something genuinely serious without making the seriousness into a lesson or the comedy into a deflection. And so the seasons continue, each one building on what came before, each one adding to the accumulation of Springfield that we have been exploring across these 4 hours. Season 5 with its space voyage and its sideshow Bob opera, and its Marge addiction storyline, and Homer's barbershop quartet, which was really a Beatles biography told in miniature through the 4 men of the B. Sharps. Season 6 with its cliffhanger. Season 7 with its resolutions and its Homer's phobia, and its Mother Simpson and its Lisa the Vegetarian, and its flash forward to Lisa's wedding. Season 8 with its Globex Corporation and its Hank Scorpio and its relentless excellence. Season 9 with its controversial choices and its Tamzarian reveal, and its moments of genuine continued quality. Season 10 and beyond, the longer, more debated period that contained within it episodes worth defending, and episodes that demonstrated the difficulty of sustaining quality across this volume of production over this length of time. All of it Springfield. All of it the same town, the same family, the same couch at the end of every episode, the same children who did not age, the same parents who did not change, the same plant on the hill with its cooling towers humming, the same Quickie Mart on the corner, the same Moe's, the same elementary, the same church, the same retirement castle. It has been 36 years. It has been one very long Sunday evening. The night is almost gone now. The tour of Springfield is nearly complete. Every section has been traveled, every character introduced, every layer of the mythology explored as carefully as 4 hours allowed. The houses on Evergreen Terrace are quiet. The lights in the neighborhood have been off for hours, except for the particular warm rectangle of the Simpson living room window, where the television glow means someone is still awake or has fallen asleep in front of it, which in this house amounts to the same thing. Homer is on the couch. The credits are rolling on whatever he was watching. He will sleep there until Marge comes to find him in the morning, and the day will begin again, and he will go to work and come home and sit on the couch, and the whole ordinary, miraculous cycle will continue. Outside, Springfield breathes its particular air. The plant hums. The quick E-Mart sign buzzes faintly in the dark. Somewhere, Ned Flanders is finishing his prayers. Somewhere, Mo is wiping down the last glass and locking the front door. Somewhere, Bart is lying awake thinking about something he is going to regret. Somewhere, Lisa is reading, her bedside lamp the only light on her side of the house. And Maggie is perfectly still, watching, knowing, keeping her own counsel as she has always kept it. Springfield is settled for the night. You can let it go now. The show will be here in the morning. The family will be on the couch. The credits music will play and the couch gag will happen, and whatever adventure the episode has prepared for them will begin. But that is morning. That is later. Right now, sleep. The tour is done. Springfield is quiet, and you have seen all of it, the plant and the family and the mythology and the golden episodes and the dark material and the philosophy and the voices and the history and every character who ever lived on these animated streets. It was worth seeing. It is always worth seeing. Good night from Springfield. The world as it was on the day he loved it most, kept safe, kept whole, kept exactly as it was.